Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, it would be a nice idea if you could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Please don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed, and let's begin. Story 1, Silent Footsteps on Old Mill Path, Haunting Presence in Appalachia. The morning air was sharp with the scent of damp earth and pine needles as I set out on the trail, the crunch of my boots muffled beneath the towering canopy of the Appalachian backcountry. I carried my pack tightly against my back, the familiar way to comfort more than a burden. A map folded in the side pocket, a compass hanging around my neck, and a battered journal tucked inside, my way of keeping track, of not losing myself entirely to the solitude. The trail was less traveled here, marked on my map as the Old Mill Path, a route that promised solitude and a brush with a landscape mostly untouched by the heavy hand of progress. I hoped to find a quiet place to camp by nightfall, maybe near a stream if I was lucky. The first few hours passed with the steady rhythm of walking, the occasional pause to sip water or adjust my pack. The sun filtered through the canopy, casting long shafts of light onto the moss-covered rocks. I felt the familiar buzz of being alive in the wild, alert, but peaceful. It was the kind of day that made the city feel like a distant memory, like another life entirely. I was nearing a small clearing when I caught sight of something odd, a rusted metal barrel half buried in the undergrowth, its faded paint peeling like old bark. The barrel wasn't on any map, and it certainly wasn't something I expected to find in this stretch of forest. I knelt down, brushing away the leaves around it, and noticed a faded stencil on the side, property of Appalachian Timber Company. The company was long out of business, their logging operations shut down decades ago. Yet here was this relic, a silent witness to a past I hadn't known existed. Curiosity nudged me deeper into the clearing. To one side, the remains of what looked like a makeshift campsite lay scattered, a rusted cooking pot, fragments of broken glass bottles, and a few rotted wooden pallets. The place was abandoned, but the sign suggested someone had been here not too long ago. That unsettled me more than the rusted barrel. As I stood, brushing dirt and leaves from my hands, a sudden noise made me freeze, the crack of a branch snapping somewhere beyond the trees. My heart quickened, the calm of the forest suddenly feeling less welcoming. I scanned the shadows, but saw no one. Maybe a deer, or a squirrel startled by my presence. Yet the sound didn't fit the usual rhythm of the woods, it was sharp, deliberate. I debated whether to keep moving or retreat. The trail ahead was supposed to lead to a creek, a good spot to refill my water and rest. I decided to push on, but with more caution. As I moved, I noticed faint footprints in the soft mud, too large for a deer, and oddly spaced, as if someone had been walking carefully through the underbrush. The footprints led toward the creek, and as I approached the sound of running water, an uneasy feeling settled in my chest. The trees thinned, and the sunlight bounced off the surface of a small ribbon of water cutting through the forest floor. But something was off. The water had a strange sheen, almost oily in the way it caught the light, and the smell was faintly metallic, like iron mixed with something sour. I knelt to cup the water in my hands, hesitating before bringing it to my lips. The taste was bitter, sharper than a natural stream should be. I swallowed anyway, telling myself it was just a trick of the senses. But a flicker of doubt lodged itself in my mind. Just then, voices drifted through the trees, low, urgent. I stood quickly, scanning the edge of the creek, and saw two figures emerge from the shadows. Both wore worn jeans and flannel shirts, their faces weathered by sun and wind. The older man's eyes were hard, his voice rough as he called out, "You shouldn't be here." I raised my hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm just hiking through. Didn't mean to trespass." The younger man stepped forward, his gaze sharp. "This land's been dangerous for years. People don't come here anymore. You don't know what's buried in this water." I frowned. What do you mean? The water looks off, but I didn't think. The creek's poisoned, the older man interrupted. Decades ago, some illegal mining went on up the ridge. They dumped waste in the valley, and it seeped down into the water. Folks who drank from it, they changed. Hollow eyes, desperate like they're clawing just to survive. I swallowed hard, the bitterness in my mouth suddenly more than just the water. Changed how? The younger man's expression darkened. You don't want to find out. Best leave before it's too late. Their warning hung in the air between us like a heavy fog, the forest suddenly feeling less like a refuge and more like a trap. My mind raced, was this just local superstition, or something far worse? I glanced back toward the trail, then at the creek, then at the two men who had appeared as if from nowhere, guarding secrets I was only beginning to understand. The quiet wilderness around us seemed to hold its breath, waiting. And I knew, without fully understanding why, that I was already in deeper than I should have been. A subtle shift in the wind carried a whispered warning, urging me to choose carefully. Escape felt both urgent and impossible now. That night, the forest didn't settle. I hadn't expected to be camped so close to the logging site, but the terrain left me little choice. I needed to know more. Who were those men? How far did the contamination stretch? And why hadn't anyone shut down the area for good? As the fire dwindled in the small stone ring outside, I decided that at first light, I'd explore the logging camp again, this time more carefully. Morning came cold and gray, the sun struggling through a low blanket of clouds. I packed up quietly, leaving my tent and gear behind, and headed back down the ridge toward the camp. The ground was damp from overnight mist, and the scent of wet pine and decaying leaves filled the air. The only sounds were my boots on the soft earth and the occasional snapping of twigs. The camp lay just beyond a cluster of dead pines. The skeletal remains of old cabins and rusting machinery stood like monuments to a forgotten era. Most of the buildings had collapsed or were overrun with vines and moss. The air here was heavier, the smell less like forest and more metallic, something sour beneath the dampness. I moved carefully, noting the shattered windows, the twisted wheel of an abandoned truck, and the remnants of a makeshift blacksmith's forge. Near the creek, I spotted a rusted barrel tipped on its side, corroded and leaking a dark, viscous liquid into the soil. My stomach churned at the sight. This had to be the source. As I crouched to examine the barrel, I heard a low noise, a scraping or dragging sound from deeper in the camp. My pulse quickened. I wasn't alone. I stood and scanned the ruins. From behind a crumbling wall, a woman emerged. She was in her late 30s, her hair tangled and pulled back loosely. Her eyes were sharp, but there was a weariness in her expression, like she'd seen too much. She froze when she saw me, her hand tightening on a rusted crowbar she carried. "You here to cause trouble?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "No," I said, raising my hands to show I meant no harm. "I'm just trying to understand what happened here." She studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Name's Mara. I'm one of the few who still comes around. You're lucky I found you first. The others don't like strangers poking around." "Why?" I asked, gesturing toward the barrel and the ruined camp. What really happened here? Mara hesitated, then gestured for me to follow her to a nearby cabin that was still somewhat intact. Inside, dust motes floated in the weak light filtering through broken shutters. She pulled out a worn notebook from a cracked wooden table. "Back in the 70s, she began, there was this illegal mining operation on the ridge, a small group of men digging for something valuable. They didn't care about the law or the damage they caused. They dumped their waste right into the valley, right into the creek. The company that should have regulated them looked the other way, probably paid off. When it all came crashing down, they vanished, but the damage stayed." I flipped through the notebook, filled with faded photographs, yellowed newspaper clippings, and scribbled notes. One photo showed a group of men standing by a rusted excavator, their faces grim and hardened. Another was of a newspaper headline, "Toxic Waste Scandal Rocks County." "They poisoned the water," Mara said quietly. "People living downstream started getting sick. At first it was just stomach problems and rashes, but then something worse. Folks began disappearing, or showing up near the creek with empty eyes, desperate and wild. The ones who drank the water, well, they never quite came back." I swallowed hard. "Do you think the men you mentioned earlier, the ones I met, are affected?" Mara's gaze darkened. "Maybe. Or maybe they're just trying to protect what's left. You don't come here looking for answers unless you want trouble." I looked out the cracked window toward the creek, the water sluggish and dark. I felt a sudden urge to drink again, to test it, but the bitter taste from before warned me off. "Have you ever tried to get help? Authorities? Scientists?" I asked. Mara shook her head. "Tried. Nobody listens. They call us crazy or worse. Besides, the logging company still owns the land around here, and they want it forgotten. This place is a ghost, and the locals prefer it that way." Suddenly, a sharp noise cut through the quiet, a branch snapping close by. Mara tensed, her hand going to the crowbar again. "Who's there?" I whispered. No answer. Just the wind shifting through the trees. "We're not alone," Mara said grimly. "There's others. People who found this place and decided to stay. They don't want visitors. Especially not ones asking questions." I felt the weight of her words settle over me. The unease I'd been carrying since the creek had now morphed into something far more tangible. This wasn't just about poisoned water or abandoned camps, it was about people, and what they become after years of isolation and desperation. I glanced back at the notebook, the photographs, the stories etched in fading ink. The past was alive here, crawling under the skin like a slow poison. "Maybe it's better to leave," I said softly. Mara shook her head. "Maybe. But if you do, be careful. Because once you've seen what's here, the forest doesn't let you go easily." As I stepped outside, a shadow moved near the edge of the tree line. Something or someone was watching. And I was certain now that the danger wasn't just in the water. It was waiting in the silence. I woke to the low thrum of rain against the rusted tin roof, a steady rhythm that seemed to press in on the cabin's thin walls. I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and sat up on the narrow cot. The weight of last night's conversation lingered heavily in the room, twisting the air between us into something taut and uneasy. "Did you hear that?" Mara asked softly, nodding toward the window. I followed her gaze. The creek looked darker than before, the water sluggish and thick, a sheen of oily film glinting faintly in the rain. It wasn't just murky, it was unnatural, like the surface of a pond left to rot. "I didn't think it could get worse," I said, my voice hoarse. Mara shook her head. "It's been creeping up the valley for years. The logging company tried to cover it up, but the sludge is spreading faster now. The creek's not just poisoned, it's a slow death." I swallowed hard and glanced at the faded photographs spread across the battered table. Faces of men and women, some smiling, others grim, all frozen in time at the edge of that forsaken mine. I traced a finger over one of the images, a man with hollow eyes and a tight-lipped smile. "Do you think this is what happened to those men?" I asked. Mara's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's what I fear. The ones who drank the water, who had no choice, changed. Not just sick, but desperate. They lost themselves. Some still wander the woods, shadows of who they were." The rain intensified, tapping harder on the roof like a warning. I felt the urge to move, to do something, anything, but the weight of the past and present crushed that impulse. "We need proof," I said. "If the authorities won't listen, maybe we can gather evidence ourselves. Water samples, soil tests. Something concrete." Mara's eyes flickered with a mix of hope and caution. "It's not just the sludge you have to worry about. The people who live off it, they don't like strangers poking around. Especially not someone poking at the truth." Before I could respond, a sharp knock echoed on the cabin door, slicing through the quiet. Mara's hand shot to the crowbar by her side. "Who is it?" she called, voice steady but low. No answer. The knocking came again, 3 quick raps, then a pause, then 2 more. It was deliberate, a signal, not a mistake. Mara exchanged a glance with me. "They're here," she whispered. I felt my heart thudding against my ribs. "Who? The men from the logging camp?" She nodded. "Or worse. People who've been out here longer than anyone should. Survivors of the mine. They don't want us here." I stood and moved to the door, feeling the cold wood beneath my fingertips. "I'm not leaving." "Not yet." Mara squeezed my arm. "Then we need to be smart." We moved quietly to the back of the cabin, peering out through the gap in the boards. The rain blurred the trees, but I caught glimpses of figures moving just beyond the tree, gaunt, hunched, faces shadowed beneath soaked caps and hoods. One stepped forward, holding something that caught the fading light, a lantern, its flickering flame barely piercing the gloom. "They're watching us," I said. Mara shook her head. "They've been watching for days. They know you're not just another hiker. You're digging where you shouldn't." A sudden crack from behind startled me. I spun, heart racing, but it was only a fallen branch breaking under the weight of the rain. "We have to get out there," I said, urgency creeping into my voice. "We can't let them scare us off." Mara's eyes narrowed. "No. We need to understand what we're dealing with first." I hesitated, then nodded. "All right. But we can't wait forever." She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small, battered notebook. "I found this tucked beneath the floorboards last night." She handed it to me, fingers trembling slightly. The cover was stained and worn, the leather cracked. Inside were cramped, hurried notes and crude sketches, maps of the mine, diagrams of machinery, and ominous references to the seep and the rot. "This is from one of the miners," Mara said. "He wrote about the sludge spreading underground, poisoning the wells, turning men into something else." I flipped through the pages, stopping at a passage scrawled in shaky handwriting. "If you drink the creek, you lose more than your health. You lose your mind, your reason. It starts with the eyes empty, searching. Then the hunger. Can't stop. Don't want to. We're trapped in a cage made of poison." A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just a story or a warning, it was a confession. "We have to find that mine," I said. "If we can see it for ourselves, maybe we can figure out how to stop this." Mara looked at me, her face pale but resolute. "There's a path that leads down from here. It's overgrown, but it might still be passable." We packed what we could: water bottles, the notebook, a small first aid kit, and slipped out into the rain, the forest closing around us like a living thing. The air smelled damp and sour, heavy with decay. As we moved deeper into the woods, the trees grew denser, the underbrush thick and clawing at our legs. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump, my senses sharpened by fear and adrenaline. After what felt like hours, we came to a clearing, and there it was, the entrance to the mine, half hidden by moss and vines, a gaping maw in the earth that seemed to breathe a cold, stale air. Mara shone her flashlight inside. The beam caught broken machinery, rusted rails, and the glint of stained boards. The smell hit me then, a sickly sweetness mixed with rot. I stepped closer, heart pounding. This is it. Suddenly, a guttural shout echoed from the trees behind us. We're not alone, Mara whispered, grabbing my arm. They're coming. We turned to see figures emerging from the shadows, haggard, wild-eyed, moving fast. There was no turning back now. The forest had claimed its prisoners, and it wasn't about to let anyone leave untouched. Night had fallen in a thick shroud by the time Mara and I scrambled away from the mine's gaping mouth, the figures in the shadows still echoing in my ears like distant thunder. I kept glancing back, half expecting those wild-eyed figures to burst from the trees, but the forest seemed to hold its breath instead, as though waiting for something worse. We found a hollowed-out spot beneath a fallen oak, its roots like grasping fingers curling around the earth, and collapsed there. Mara pulled her jacket tighter around her, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled the notebook from her pack again. We can't stay near the mine, she said softly, her voice barely above the whisper of the wind. They'll come back. And if they catch us, she swallowed hard, the words hanging unfinished. I nodded. We need to find the creek. The one the miners wrote about. If we can follow it upstream, maybe we can see where the sludge is coming from. Or if there's any way to stop it. Mara's eyes flicked to mine, a flicker of something like hope or desperation there. You really think that's possible? I have to, I said. Even if it's just to understand what we're dealing with. We agreed to move at first light, despite the exhaustion pressing down on us like a weight. The forest around us felt alive in a way I hadn't noticed before, not with the chirps of birds or the rustle of squirrels, but with something darker, more watchful. I tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to my skin like a second layer. Morning came slow, the sun a pale smear behind thick clouds. We packed up quickly, our gear damp and heavy, and set off along the faint trail Mara had pointed out. The path was barely a whisper, swallowed by brambles and moss, but we pushed through, cutting branches and wrestling with underbrush until the sound of running water finally reached us. The creek was a narrow ribbon of dark water, winding through the trees with a sluggish, oily sheen that caught the weak light in sickly rainbow colors. My stomach twisted as I knelt beside it, dipping a hand carefully into the water. It was cold and viscous, smelling faintly metallic like iron and chemicals and something rotten beneath it. Mara pulled out a small vial from her pack and filled it slowly, shaking it as if the act might somehow dilute the horror inside. If this is what they drank, no wonder they turned out like that. I looked upstream, eyes straining through the mist. The creek disappeared into a thick tangle of ferns and fallen trees, and beyond that, I could just make out the faint outline of a rusted pipe half buried in the mud. There, I said. That pipe has to be the source. We followed the creek cautiously, stepping over roots slick with moss and sidestepping pools of stagnant water that bubbled faintly with trapped gas. The forest seemed to close in tighter here, the canopy blocking what little light filtered through the clouds. Every so often, I thought I heard something moving just beyond the edge of sight, a snapping twig, a low murmur, but when I looked, there was nothing. Mara kept close, occasionally glancing behind us with a worried frown. I don't like this, she said. The miner's notes mentioned the sludge spreading underground, but if that pipe's leaking, the poison's coming right to the surface. A low growl broke the silence, sharp and animalistic. We froze, hearts pounding. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the crunch of leaves and twigs. I peered into the shadows and saw a figure emerge, a man, gaunt and filthy, his eyes wide and hollow, skin mottled with sores and dirt. He stumbled toward us, arms outstretched like a predator sensing prey. Mara grabbed my arm and pulled me back, whispering urgently, "Don't make eye contact." The man stopped a few feet away, breathing heavily, his gaze unfocused but desperate. He muttered something, a string of incoherent words, and then lunged forward. We scrambled back, tripping over roots as he advanced, his nails digging into my jacket, Mara shoved him hard, and he collapsed into the mud with a guttural cry. But more figures were coming, 3 more, then 5, all gaunt, wild-eyed, circling us like wolves. "We have to run," Mara hissed, dragging me away from the creek's edge. We sprinted blindly through the underbrush, branches clawing at our faces, mud sucking at our boots. The figures were behind us, their ragged breaths and guttural snarls closing in. I stumbled, my knee hitting a rock hard enough to send a jolt of pain up my leg, but Mara grabbed my hand and yanked me to my feet. "Keep moving," she urged. We burst into a small clearing, but it wasn't safe. There, standing like sentinels, were more of them, men and women, their faces twisted with hunger and despair. I recognized the same hollow eyes from the notebook, the same haunted look that the miners had described. One of them stepped forward, a woman whose hair hung in greasy strands over a face streaked with grime. Her voice was low and urgent. "You shouldn't be here. This place, it's ours now." Mara swallowed hard. "We don't want trouble. We just want to understand." The woman's eyes flicked to the vial in Mara's hand, then back to us. "Understanding won't save you." Suddenly, the group surged forward, a wave of desperation and menace. Mara and I backed toward the trees, but there was nowhere to go. The forest had become a trap, and these people, the poisoned, the lost, were its guardians. I glanced at Mara, her face pale but fierce. "We have to fight." She nodded grimly, pulling a sturdy branch from the ground. I found a heavy rock and gripped it tightly, the cold sweat on my palms mixing with the mud. The first figure lunged at me, and everything narrowed to a brutal, desperate struggle, growls, shouts, the sickening thud of bodies hitting earth and wood. Amid the chaos, I caught a glimpse of the rusted pipe leaking dark sludge into the creek, a silent reminder of the poison that had turned this forest into a nightmare. And I realized then, if we didn't stop this, no one else would ever leave this place alive. When the first pale light of dawn sifted through the dense canopy, the forest finally fell silent. But the forest didn't feel any safer now. We moved cautiously, keeping close to the shadows of the trees, away from the creek where the rusted pipe still oozed its black poison. Mara's face was drawn, her eyes haunted by what we'd done and what we'd seen. I couldn't blame her. For hours, I'd felt the same numbness settle into my bones. "We need to get out of here," I said quietly, voice hoarse from shouting in fear. "Before anyone else shows up." She nodded, but didn't speak. Instead, she pulled out the vial we'd taken from the camp. The dark liquid inside caught the pale light, swirling like a storm trapped in glass. "We have proof," Mara said. "But what do we do with it?" I sighed. "First, we get to safety. Then we find someone who'll listen." The hike-out was slow and tense. Every crack of a twig, every distant bird call, set my nerves on edge. My knee throbbed with every step, a sharp reminder of how close we'd come to being trapped forever. Mara stayed beside me, her presence a fragile anchor in the wilderness. By midday, we reached the edge of the forest where the trees thinned, and the faint hum of a road teased our ears. A gravel path curved into view, winding toward the small town Mara had mentioned, the one where the logging camp had once thrived. As we stepped onto the path, the weight of the forest seemed to lift just slightly, but the memory of those hollow eyes followed us like a shadow. At the town, things felt oddly frozen in time. The streets were quiet, storefronts shuttered, and the few people we saw glanced at us with wary suspicion. I realized then that the poison hadn't just corrupted the land, it had seeped into the very heart of this community, twisting fear and silence into a thick fog. We found the local sheriff's office, a weathered building with faded letters above the door. Mara knocked, and after a few tense moments, a middle-aged man opened it. His eyes were sharp, but tired. "We need to talk," Mara said, stepping forward. She held out the vial carefully. "About the logging camp, the creek, the poison." The sheriff's face darkened as he took the vial, studying the murky liquid. "I've heard the stories," he said quietly. "But no one wanted to believe them. Too many lives tied up in those mines. Too many secrets buried." I nodded. "We saw what it's doing. People out there, some still living near the camp, they're sick. Desperate. They don't look like people anymore." He sighed heavily. "I'll get the state involved. Environmental agencies. We'll have to shut down the area, clean it up if we can. But it won't be easy. This land has been poisoned for decades." Mara and I exchanged a glance. We'd come hoping for answers, but had found a much deeper, uglier truth. The forest wasn't just a place of beauty and solitude, it was a graveyard of broken promises and forgotten lives. As the sheriff made calls, Mara turned to me. "What now?" I thought about the endless trees, the faces we'd seen, and the creeping sludge that had stained the creek. "We find a way to fight back," I said. "Not just for us, but for them. For everyone who's been swallowed by this poison." She smiled faintly, the first real warmth I'd seen from her in days. "Then we keep going." That night, in a small motel room with a cracked window letting in the hum of distant traffic, I wrote. I wrote down everything: the camp, the people, the fight, and the poison. Mara helped, her hands steady despite the exhaustion in her eyes. We knew the story would be hard to tell, that some would deny it, others would turn away. But it mattered. It had to. As I closed my notebook, I felt something shift inside me. The helplessness, the fear, it was still there, but beneath it, a stubborn spark. I had come here seeking adventure, maybe a little escape. Instead, I'd found a reckoning. A reminder that some places hold stories we cannot ignore, and some truths demand to be faced, no matter the cost. I looked out the window at the dark sky, the stars faint and distant. The forest was far behind us now, but its shadow lingered. And I knew this was only the beginning. Because even when poison seeps silently, and desperation turns people into ghosts of themselves, the will to survive and to fight can burn brighter than any darkness. And so, we would carry that fire forward. The road ahead was uncertain, winding through lands scarred by silence and secrets. Yet, beneath the weight of that uncertainty, I felt a spark, fragile, yes, but undeniable. It whispered of resilience, of bonds forged not in ease but in struggle. We were no longer just survivors, we were witnesses to a truth that demanded reckoning. Every step we took was a defiance of the shadows that sought to claim us. The night held its breath, as if waiting for what would come next. And though the stars seemed faint, their glimmers were enough to guide us, for even the smallest light can pierce the deepest darkness. This journey was far from over, but together, we would face whatever lay ahead, carrying that fire until dawn. With resolve burning brighter than ever, we pressed forward into the unknown, unyielding. Story 2, Delayed Reflection, When Mirrors Betray. Most mornings began in the same way, the sharp buzz of my alarm clock, the cool scrape of running water as I washed my face, and the faint, persistent drip of a slow leak somewhere in the bathroom. That morning, like every other, I shuffled into the bathroom, still half dreaming, and flicked on the light. The fluorescent bulb buzzed to life overhead, casting its harsh glow over the cracked mirror above the sink. I caught my reflection and frowned at the way my eyes were still puffy from sleep. I raised a hand to smooth the rumpled hair from my forehead, but as I moved, something felt off. The reflection didn't move with me. Not exactly. There was a delay, maybe a second, barely noticeable, but enough that my reflection seemed to lag behind my actual movements. I froze and blinked, willing my eyes to cooperate. I waved a finger in front of the glass, slow and deliberate. The reflection followed, but a fraction of a second later. I shook my head, telling myself it was just a trick of light, a tired brain misreading the image. I leaned in closer, the uneven surface of the mirror distorting my features slightly. The delay persisted. I tapped the glass lightly with a fingertip. Still lagging. I blinked again, harder this time, and blinked away a rising tide of unease. Maybe the mirror was faulty. Maybe my eyes were strained. Maybe I was still too tired. I turned away, shook my head, and went about my morning, brushing my teeth, rinsing, dressing. I tried not to think about the mirror. But when I passed the bathroom again, before leaving the apartment, I couldn't resist glancing back. The reflection smiled. I didn't. I stopped cold in the hallway, heart tightening. I stepped forward and looked again. The mirror showed me standing still, lips curling upward in a grin I hadn't made. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked carefully. The smile remained, slow and deliberate, as if the reflection was mocking me. My own face, behind me in the room, remained neutral, even tense. I backed away, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast oddly, maybe my brain filling gaps after the odd delay. But the unease clung tight, like a cold sweat under my skin. I closed the bathroom door behind me and leaned against it, breathing deeply. The city was waking up outside my window, cars humming, distant sirens, the usual noise. Everything else was normal, or as normal as it got. Still, the memory of that smile lingered. I didn't know it then, but that was only the beginning. The day moved forward, slow and deliberate, like walking through molasses. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to me, a shadow trailing every thought. At work, I found my fingers hovering over the keyboard, hesitating before typing, my eyes darting to the door every few minutes. The usual hum of the office, the chatter and ringing phones, all seemed oddly muted, as if filtered through a layer of fog. I told myself to focus, to push it down, but the smile kept creeping back into my mind, too sharp, too knowing. Lunch came and went with little appetite. I sat at the corner cafe, stirring my coffee absently, watching people pass by with their lives moving in ordinary patterns. I envied them. I wanted to believe this was all a fluke, a trick of my imagination, but deep down I feared it wasn't. Back at my desk, an email popped up from an unknown sender. The subject line was blank. I hesitated before opening it, and when I did, the message was just one line. You saw me. No signature. No explanation. Just those 3 words, cold and deliberate. My heart hammered in my chest. Was someone watching me? Or was this some sick joke? I stared at the screen, the cursor blinking, waiting for a reply that I couldn't formulate. Then another message arrived. We all do. A chill ran down my spine. I shut the computer and grabbed my coat. I needed to get out, to clear my head. The air outside was sharp, biting, but it felt real. Tangible. I walked without direction, the city's familiar streets twisting into something strange and unfamiliar. As I turned a corner, I caught sight of someone leaning against a lamppost across the street. The figure was indistinct, head bowed, but when they straightened, the smile was there again, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably the same. This time, I saw the eyes beneath it, dark, unreadable, and piercing. I blinked, and the person was gone. My phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. Not everyone wants to be seen. I swallowed hard, the weight of those words settling like stone in my stomach. I realized then that this wasn't random. This was a game, a puzzle with dangerous stakes. Whoever this was, they were toying with me, pulling me deeper into something I didn't understand. That night, sleep was elusive. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the streetlight outside, set my nerves on edge. I kept the blinds closed, the doors locked, but it wasn't enough. The smile haunted the edges of my consciousness, a constant reminder that I was no longer alone in my own world. And somewhere out there, in the city's underbelly, the player was waiting, patient, watching, smiling. The next morning, I woke before my alarm, the dull ache in my chest a reminder that sleep had been restless at best. I moved my hand, watching my reflection delay, then smile. Just that one slow, deliberate smile, the same impossible thing that had haunted me in the street and in my mind. I swallowed hard, turning away before the smile could deepen, before the reflection could mock me with its unnatural timing. I dressed quickly and forced myself to eat breakfast, though the bread tasted dry and the coffee bitter. I needed to make sense of this. To find a pattern. If this was some cruel prank, I had to find the source. My mind kept circling back to the emails and texts, those cold, cryptic lines that felt less like a joke and more like a warning. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my messages again. The unknown number, the blank subject line, the chilling simplicity of "you saw me and we all do," followed by "not everyone wants to be seen." There was no reply, no way to trace the sender through normal means. I considered calling the police but dismissed it quickly. Who would believe me? This wasn't a physical threat, at least not yet, and without proof, I'd likely be dismissed as paranoid. Instead, I decided to start small. I needed to know whether this was just me or if someone else had experienced something similar. I opened a new browser tab and typed into the search bar, reflection delay, mirror lag, reflection smiling independently. Nothing relevant. Mostly forums about optical illusions and bizarre eye conditions. Then I tried something else, creepy mirror experiences and being watched through reflections. The results were a mix of urban legends and paranormal theories, none grounded in reality. I discarded them quickly. I wasn't looking for ghosts or spirits, no matter how tempting it was to explain the unexplainable that way. I needed concrete evidence, something rational. I switched to news sites, scanning for anything about stalking or surveillance that might connect. Nothing recent matched the tone of the messages or the unease I felt. But then, as I scrolled, a headline caught my eye: local artist reports harassment, strange messages after exhibition. The article was dated just a few days ago and described a woman receiving anonymous threats and disturbing notes after a gallery opening. The details were vague, but one line stood out. She described feeling watched, as if someone was always just a step behind her, mimicking her movements. My heart skipped. I saved the article and searched for more information about the artist. Her name was Emily Carter. She posted several videos on social media, one showing her walking through the gallery, looking nervous, glancing repeatedly over her shoulder. Comments ranged from supportive to skeptical, but several people mentioned similar experiences of feeling followed or watched. I felt a flicker of hope. I wasn't alone. Whatever this was, it wasn't confined to me. But the thought was unsettling. If someone was doing this to multiple people, what was the point? What did they want? The day unfolded in a haze of unease. I kept catching myself glancing at reflective surfaces, windows, polished tables, the shiny screen of my phone. Each time, the lagging smile haunted me, a reminder that my own image was no longer entirely mine. At work, I avoided the bathroom mirrors and told myself it was all in my head, but the tension was growing, knotting tighter with every passing hour. That afternoon, I met with Sarah for coffee. She was one of the few people I trusted enough to tell some of what I was experiencing, though I kept the stranger messages and the reflection smile to myself. I described the lag, the feeling of being watched, and the article about Emily Carter. Sarah listened carefully, her brow furrowing. "That sounds terrifying," she said. "Have you thought about security cameras? Maybe someone's messing with you somehow, like hacking devices or using some kind of bug?" I nodded, grateful for her practical approach. I checked the apartment, but I didn't find anything. No cameras, no microphones. At least, nothing obvious. But I'm going to hire someone to sweep the place. Just in case. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Good. And maybe talk to Emily? She might have clues or be going through the same thing. I hadn't thought of that. If she was reachable, maybe we could figure out what was going on together. I promised myself I'd try. When I got home, the lingering unease had settled into something heavier. I didn't want to look in any reflective surface, but I couldn't stop myself. The mirror in the hallway caught my eye, and I froze. The reflection smiled again, that slow, measured smile, but this time the eyes seemed sharper, more calculating. I blinked and turned away, heart pounding. Then, without warning, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up with another message from the unknown number. Look closer. My breath caught. I stared at the message, then toward the mirror again. I forced myself to approach, cautiously, every step measured and deliberate. As I got closer, the reflection's smile didn't falter. But there was something else now, a flicker, a subtle shift in posture, a twitch in the corner of the mouth that didn't match my own. I reached out, fingers trembling, and tapped the glass. My reflection did the same, but a second later. And then, just for a heartbeat, the reflection's eyes flickered away, as if they were searching beyond the glass, past me, somewhere else. I stumbled back, heart hammering in my chest. The rational part of my mind screamed that it was impossible, that reflections couldn't move independently, couldn't smile when I wasn't. But the evidence was right there in front of me. Something was wrong. Something was watching. Something was playing. My phone buzzed again, this time with a picture attached. I hesitated before opening it, then clicked. The photo was grainy, taken from a distance. It showed my apartment building, the window of my living room illuminated against the dark night. But there was something else in the frame, a figure standing across the street, just barely visible in the shadows, watching. No smile this time. Just a silhouette, still and silent. I dropped the phone on the counter, hands shaking. The game wasn't just in my head. It was real. And it was closing in. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by the window, watching the street below, waiting. But the figure never appeared. Until the phone buzzed again. This time, the message was different. Tomorrow, you'll see who's really behind the smile. I woke to the faint gray light of early morning slipping through the blinds, the city still wrapped in a fragile silence. I sat up slowly, careful not to disturb the knot in my stomach. The apartment was quiet, save for the soft hum of the radiator and the distant murmur of traffic beginning to stir. I glanced at the mirror across the room, my reflection stared back, calm and still, but I knew better now than to trust it. Despite myself, I moved toward it, every step measured, heart thudding in my chest. As usual, my reflection lagged behind by a second. I raised my hand slowly, watching the mirror copy the motion with that faint delay. Then, when I smiled, forcing the corners of my mouth up, though the feeling wasn't there, the reflection's smile stayed, lingering a fraction longer once mine dropped. It was subtle, but unmistakable. I wanted to scream at the mirror, to demand answers, but there was only silence. The phone buzzed again, breaking the moment. I grabbed it, expecting another cryptic message or a photo of the shadowy figure. But instead, it was a text from my sister, Lena. Hey! Are you okay? You didn't answer last night. Her message was simple, but it felt like a lifeline. I typed back quickly, not really. Can we meet today? I need to talk. She replied almost instantly. Of course. Coffee at 11? I agreed, feeling a flicker of relief. Maybe talking to someone who knew me would help. Maybe I wasn't losing my mind entirely. After a quick shower and a restless breakfast, I left the apartment. The city was waking up, people hurrying past, oblivious to whatever was unraveling in my life. I kept my phone in my pocket, eyes flicking to every reflective surface as I walked. Mirrors, windows, even shiny cars all held the potential for that delayed smile, that eerie lag. At the coffee shop, Lena was already waiting, her brow furrowed with concern when she saw me. She hugged me tightly, then pulled back to study my face. "You look like hell," she said softly. "Thanks," I muttered, sinking into the chair opposite her. "I need to tell you something. Something weird is happening." I recounted the strange reflection, the messages, the picture of the figure outside my window. Lena listened, silent and still, like she was trying to process it all without judgment. "That sounds terrifying," she said finally. "But do you think someone's actually messing with you? Like a prank or something?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But it's more than that. The reflection, it's like it's alive, but it's not me. And the messages, they're from someone who's watching." Lena's phone buzzed, and she glanced down quickly, then locked the screen. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be rude. Just, this kind of thing isn't really my thing." I nodded, sensing her discomfort. "I get it. But I need help." She hesitated, then said, "Okay, but we need to be smart about this. If someone's stalking you or hacking your phone, we should tell the police." I thought about that, but what if they're already inside? What if they can watch everything I do? My voice dropped to a whisper. What if they're here right now? Lena reached across the table, gripping my hand. "Look, we'll figure it out. Together." The morning passed in a blur of uneasy plans. We decided to check the security footage from my building's lobby, hoping to spot the shadowy figure. I called the building manager, Mr. Harris, an older man with a reputation for being helpful but a little nosy. When I explained the situation, he was skeptical but agreed to let me see the footage. "But I don't know how much help it'll be," he warned. "These cameras aren't exactly high-tech." We met him at the lobby that afternoon. The security room was cramped, lined with dusty monitors showing various parts of the building. Mr. Harris fumbled through the controls, rewinding the footage from the night before. "Here," he said, pointing at the screen. The grainy image showed the front entrance, time-stamped just after midnight. A figure lingered across the street, just like in the photo. The silhouette was indistinct, but there was no mistaking the posture, watchful, deliberate. "Can you zoom in?" I asked, leaning closer. Mr. Harris adjusted the settings, but the image became more pixelated. Suddenly, the figure turned toward the camera for a split second. My heart skipped. The face was hidden in shadow, but the eyes, cold, calculating, met the lens directly. "Who is that?" Lena whispered. "I don't know," I said, voice tight. "But they've been watching me." We spent the next hour combing through the footage, looking for any other sign of the figure. Nothing else showed up, but I felt eyes on me, a pressure that didn't ease. On the way back to my apartment, Lena suggested, "Maybe we should install a camera inside your place. Something to catch whoever this is." I agreed reluctantly. The thought of a stranger inside my home was terrifying, but I needed answers. And if the reflection was somehow connected, maybe the camera would reveal it. That night, I set up the camera facing the mirror in the living room. I double-checked the angle, making sure everything was in view. Then I sat down, phone in hand, waiting. The reflection appeared as always, lagging by a second. I smiled, forcing the expression, watching the delayed copy. Then the reflection smiled back, that slow, measured smile. But tonight, it seemed different. More urgent. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. A new message from the unknown number. "Look behind you." I spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. Just the usual clutter of my apartment. I turned back to the mirror and froze. In the reflection, the room looked wrong. The chair where I sat was empty. The reflection of the camera blinked off, then on again. And in the far corner, behind me, a shadow moved. I don't remember breathing. I don't remember thinking. But I knew one thing for certain: I was now alone. And whatever was behind that shadow wasn't smiling. Yet. For a long moment, I just stared at the mirror, unable to tear my eyes away from that shifting shadow. It wasn't quite human, too fluid, too dark, like a smear of ink bleeding through the glass. My pulse hammered in my ears. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were glued to the floor. Slowly, I turned around again. Nothing. The apartment was still as always, cluttered with half-unpacked boxes and the faint scent of stale coffee. No one there. No shadow. No threat. I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light, exhaustion playing games with my mind. But the mirror told a different story. I glanced back. The figure was still there, still watching. I took a cautious step forward. The reflection rippled, as if the glass were a thin veil between two worlds. My breath hitched when the shadow raised a hand. Just a faint movement, but I told myself it was just someone playing a cruel joke. Someone who knew my routine, my apartment layout, maybe even had a key. But knowing didn't make the fear any easier to swallow. The reflection lagging behind was one thing, maybe some weird trick of light or fatigue, but the shadow? That was a warning I couldn't ignore. Lena called early, her voice sharp with concern. "Did you sleep at all?" "Not really," I admitted. "I'm going to the precinct today. Maybe if I talk to someone official." "Good. I'll come with you," she said firmly. "We're not dealing with ghosts. Someone's stalking you, and they're getting bolder." Her confidence steadied me. I wasn't ready to face this alone. The precinct was a gray building, sterile and unwelcoming, its walls holding 1,000 stories of desperation and cruelty. Detective Marlowe greeted us with a tired nod, his eyes flickering over the printouts I brought, the photos, the screenshots from the camera, the message. "You say the shadow was only visible through the camera?" His brow furrowed. "Yes," I said. "And the reflection always lags by a second." But the reflection smiled when I wasn't smiling. Last night, the camera blinked off and on, and in the reflection, the room looked wrong, like there was someone behind me. Marlowe rubbed his chin. "Could be an editing trick. Someone messing with you." "But why? And how?" I asked, voice cracking. "I don't have enemies. I don't even know who that figure is." He nodded slowly. "We'll check your apartment for signs of forced entry. And we'll see if the unknown number's registered anywhere." Lena and I left the precinct with a promise that they'd look into it, but I felt no relief. If anything, the official involvement made the threat more real. I wasn't hallucinating. Someone was watching me, manipulating the reflection, and maybe even stepping into my life. Back at the apartment, I avoided the mirror. I sat with my back to it, trying to ignore the sense of being watched. Lena paced the room, her phone glued to her ear. "Keep your phone close," she said after hanging up. "Marlowe's running the number. It's untraceable so far, but he's calling in favors." I nodded, swallowing a lump in my throat. The silence stretched between us, heavy and thick. Then, without warning, my phone buzzed. A message from the unknown number, "Look outside." My heart thudded painfully. I glanced out the window, expecting to see the shadowed figure waiting across the street. But all I saw was the usual quiet block, cars parked haphazardly, a dog walker passing by, a mail truck rumbling off. I was about to close the blinds when movement caught my eye. Across the street, in the narrow alley between two buildings, a man leaned against the brick wall, his head bowed. He wasn't making eye contact, but something about his posture screamed menace. He looked familiar, like I'd seen him before, but I couldn't place where. Lena watched me, eyes sharp. "Who is that?" "I don't know," I whispered. "But I'm going to find out." I grabbed my coat and keys. The air outside was cold and biting, the kind that made your breath visible in quick bursts. Lena trailed behind me as I crossed the street, my mind racing. When I reached the alley, the man was gone. No footprints in the dirt. No sign he'd been there at all, except for the faint scent of cigarette smoke lingering in the damp air. I shivered, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt. Back at the apartment, I locked every door and window, double-checked the cameras, and sat down to review the footage again. That's when I noticed it, a figure lurking just out of focus in the hallway behind the mirror, barely visible for a frame or two. Closer this time. Almost close enough to touch. My phone buzzed again. "You can't hide." I dropped the phone, heart pounding so loud it filled the room. Lena reached for it, her hands steady but her eyes wild. "We need to get you out of here," she said quietly. Before I could reply, the power blinked off, plunging us into darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then the unmistakable sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed from the hallway outside the living room. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped just beyond the doorway. A cold presence filled the room, no smile this time, just a suffocating weight. And then, a whisper, barely audible, "I've been waiting." The morning light seeped in unevenly through the cracked blinds, casting thin stripes across the room. When I finally forced myself to sit up, I caught my reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. It was there, just a second behind me, just as it had been every morning for weeks. But today, something was different. The delay was no longer a trick of my mind, it was a warning, a message I hadn't fully understood until now. The reflection smiled. Not the weak, uncertain smile of before, but a slow, deliberate curl of the lips. An unnerving expression that didn't belong to me, one that I had never felt when staring back at myself. I swallowed hard and stepped back. For the first time, I didn't feel like the reflection was just a distorted image. It felt like someone else, someone who had been inside me all along. I thought about Lena. About how she had insisted I leave the apartment, how she had tried to protect me when I was too lost in my own fear to see the danger. She had been right. The apartment wasn't safe. Nothing about this was safe. I dressed quickly and made my way to the front door. As I reached for the handle, my phone buzzed on the counter. I hesitated but checked it anyway. A single message, "You're running out of time." I didn't recognize the number, but I knew exactly who it was from. The figure from the alley. The one who had been watching me for weeks. I locked the door behind me, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against my back. Outside, the street was calm, too calm. Cars lined the curb, a few early risers buzzed past on bikes, and the mail truck rumbled down the block. But I felt isolated, like the world had shrunk to a pinpoint centered on me. I called Lena. "Where are you?" she asked, voice sharp but worry-laden. "Outside." "I need to find him," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Don't. Please." But I was already moving, stepping into the alley where I'd seen the man before. The scent of cigarette smoke was still there, faint but unmistakable. I scanned the bricks, the trash bins, the shadows, looking for any sign of him. Then I heard a soft shuffle behind me. I spun around. No one. But the hairs on my neck stood on end. I could almost feel his breath, the same one that had whispered, "I've been waiting." I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the small pepper spray Lena had given me, just in case. "Show yourself," I demanded, voice low, steady. Silence. Then a voice, rough and close. "You don't know what you're dealing with." I turned slowly, and there he was, the man from the alley, the one whose face I had struggled to place. Up close, his features were sharp, his eyes cold and calculating. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, trying to keep the tremble out of my voice. He smiled then, the same slow, deliberate smile that my reflection had worn every morning. "Because you weren't paying attention. Because you thought you were alone." "I'm not afraid of you," I said, surprising myself with the conviction. He laughed, a bitter sound. "You should be." Before I could react, he took a step forward. I raised the pepper spray and sprayed it in his face. He staggered back, coughing, and I took the chance to run. I didn't stop until I was back inside my apartment, locking the door behind me with shaking hands. I called the police, explained everything, the messages, the man in the alley, the reflection. They took my statement seriously, dispatching officers to patrol the neighborhood. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. The days that followed were a blur of interviews, security upgrades, and cautious glances over my shoulder. Lena stayed close, her presence a balm to my frayed nerves. Slowly, the reflection's delay shortened. The smile vanished. One morning, it matched me perfectly, mirroring every move without a fraction of hesitation. I realized then that the reflection had never been supernatural. It had been a symptom, a manifestation of fear, anxiety, and the invasion of my privacy by a very real threat. The man was caught a week later, thanks to the cameras Lena insisted on installing and a neighbor's timely call. He had been stalking others, hiding in plain sight behind the mirrors and shadows. I changed the locks, moved the furniture, and reclaimed my space. The apartment felt different now, not a prison, but a home. More than that, I felt different. I had been broken down by fear, but I was no longer its prisoner. I had faced the darkness, the waiting, the smiling reflection, and I had survived. One morning, as I brushed my teeth, I caught my reflection moving in sync, no delay, no smile, just me. I smiled back, genuine and unafraid. The reflection was mine again. And so was I. With that quiet victory, I stepped outside, the sunlight warming my skin, a stark contrast to the cold shadows I had left behind. Each breath felt fuller, deeper, unburdened. The city buzzed around me, indifferent yet alive, mirroring the pulse I found within myself. I knew the journey ahead wouldn't always be easy, but for the first time in a long time, I walked forward with steady feet and an open heart. Freedom wasn't just a place, it was a state of being, and I had finally found mine. Story 3, Frozen in Fear, Haunting Sleep Paralysis Encounter. I had always been a light sleeper. My name is Sarah, and I worked as a copy editor for a small but respectable publishing firm downtown. My days were spent hunched over manuscripts and emails, my nights usually quiet and uneventful. I enjoyed the routines, the way the city buzzed alive during the day, then settled into a muted lull once the sun dipped below the skyline. My life was simple, predictable. Normal. That normalcy was what made the nights so unsettling. It started about 2 weeks ago, on a night I remember clearly despite the fogginess sleep usually brings. I woke suddenly, the kind of waking that didn't feel like waking at all. My body was completely still, locked in place, as if I'd been frozen mid-breath. My eyes fluttered open, but I couldn't move a muscle. The room was dim, lit only by the pale glow of the street lamp outside filtering through the blinds. It was the kind of light that stretched long shadows across the walls, making familiar shapes look strange and unfamiliar. And then I noticed it. The presence. It wasn't a sound or a scent, but a weight in the air that pressed down on my chest and made it hard to breathe. It was like someone was standing just beyond the edge of the bed, watching me. I wanted to scream, to move, to do anything to break free, but my body refused. All I could do was lie there, heart hammering, eyes wide, trapped in that awful limbo between sleep and wakefulness. But there was no one there. When I finally snapped out of it, gasping and sweating, the room was empty. No sign of anyone else. Just the usual clutter of my bedroom, books stacked on the nightstand, the soft rumple of my duvet, the faint glow of my phone screen blinking silently on the dresser. I told myself it was just sleep paralysis. I'd read about it before, how the brain can wake before the body does, leaving you trapped and vulnerable. That it was harmless, even if terrifying. I tried to shrug it off, told myself it was nothing more than my mind playing tricks. Yet the next few nights brought the same experience. The frozen body, the heavy presence, the suffocating silence. Each time, I woke with a pounding heart and a cold sweat, but nothing else. No explanation. No intruder. Just me, alone. Last night was different. I had fallen asleep exhausted after a long day at work, my eyes heavy even before I hit the pillow. Around 3 a.m, I woke again, paralyzed and helpless. The familiar pressure settled over me like a thick blanket, heavier than before. But this time, when I dared to open my eyes, I saw it. Not just a vague feeling or a shadow, but the faint outline of a man standing just beyond the doorway. He was tall, his form blurred and indistinct in the low light, but unmistakably human. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching. Waiting. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, or my imagination conjuring shapes from the darkness, but the weight of his gaze was undeniable. It felt deliberate, patient. I wanted to wake fully, to shout or reach out, but my body was still frozen. I lay there, heart hammering, eyes fixed on the silhouette until the first pale light of dawn crept through the window and the figure vanished. When I finally could move again, I sat up abruptly, the room bathed in morning light and utterly empty. No sign of a man. No footprints, no shadow, no lingering presence. Just the quiet hum of the city waking up outside. I told myself it was a nightmare, a hallucination fueled by stress and exhaustion. But the unease clung to me, persistent and gnawing. I couldn't shake the feeling that last night's visitor was more than a figment of my mind. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. But I do know one thing, I'm not alone when I sleep anymore. And that thought terrifies me. The days that followed offered no relief. Each evening, as twilight crept in and the shadows stretched long across the walls, I found myself scanning every corner of my apartment for signs of him. The ordinary sounds, the creak of the floorboards, the distant sirens, the murmur of late-night traffic felt distorted, like a soundtrack to some unseen drama. Sleep became a battleground, my mind caught between exhaustion and paranoia. I tried to convince myself that if I ignored the fear, it would fade. I forced routines, filled the apartment with light, and kept my phone close. But the weight of his absence was heavier than ever. It wasn't just that he had come and gone without a trace, it was the implication that he could return at any moment, slipping back into my life like a ghost no one else could see. Friends noticed the change in me. My distracted glances, the way I jumped at sudden noises, the thinness around my eyes. I brushed it off with vague excuses, stress at work, the relentless pace of life. But inside, I felt fractured, as if the thin veil between reality and something darker had been torn, and I was standing exposed beneath it. Last night, I thought I heard the faintest whisper at the edge of sleep, a word I couldn't quite catch. My heart slammed against my ribs as I sat up, half expecting to see a shadow lurking just beyond the doorframe. But there was nothing. Only silence. Only the cold, indifferent dark. Still, I'm certain of one thing. Whoever or whatever visited me did not come as a friend. And now, every time I close my eyes, I brace myself for the night's unwelcome return. Because the truth is that some presences refuse to be forgotten. They linger, waiting for the moment you lower your guard. And I fear that moment is closer than I want to admit. Morning light was both a relief and a torment. The apartment was quiet except for the distant hum of the city waking up. I forced myself out of bed, every movement slow and deliberate, like I was trying not to wake something lurking beneath the surface. At the kitchen counter, I poured coffee without really tasting it. The bitter warmth was the only real thing anchoring me. I needed answers. Not the kind that came from wild guesses or sleepless speculation, but tangible proof that what I was experiencing was real, something I could confront head-on rather than run from in the dark. I had spent the last few days obsessively checking the apartment for anything out of place. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, no misplaced objects. It was as if whoever or whatever had been there was a ghost in the truest sense, seen only by me, and only at the most vulnerable moment. But last night's whisper, faint and fleeting though it was, had unsettled me more than the figure itself. I kept replaying it in my mind, trying to catch a word, a name, a clue. Nothing concrete came. Just that cold chill that settled in my chest every time I thought about it. I decided I needed to talk to someone. Not just to unload my fears, but to see if an outside perspective could help me make sense of this. I called Sarah, my closest friend since college, someone level-headed and no stranger to late-night crises, though nothing quite like this. She answered on the third ring, her voice warm but tired. "Hey, what's up? You sounded weird on the voicemail." I hesitated, then blurted out the truth, the sleep paralysis, the presence, the man in the doorway. Sarah was silent for a moment before she spoke, her tone cautious but supportive. "That sounds terrifying. Have you thought about seeing a doctor? Sleep specialists might be able to help. But also, maybe we should come over tonight. I can stay with you." I appreciated the offer, but I wasn't sure Sarah understood how deep this ran. It wasn't just about sleep paralysis, it was about feeling watched, hunted even. The idea of someone else seeing what I saw, or at least being there to protect me, was both comforting and unsettling. "Yeah," I said finally, "maybe that's not a bad idea." The rest of the day passed in a blur. I left work early, the usual noise and routine feeling distant, like I was watching from the outside. At the grocery store, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more times than necessary. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like I was waiting for something to jump out at me from the aisles. That evening, Sarah arrived with a small overnight bag, her expression serious but calm. We sat in the living room, the overhead light harsh and unflattering, casting sharp shadows against the walls. "I brought a recorder," she said, holding up a small device. "Maybe it'll catch something. I know it sounds crazy, but if there's anyone else here, maybe we can catch a hint of them." I nodded, grateful for her pragmatism. We set the recorder on the nightstand, then I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to keep my breathing steady as night fell. The hours crawled by. Sarah kept me talking, distracting me from the creeping dread that built with the darkness. But when the time came to lie down, to surrender to sleep, the old terror returned. I closed my eyes, heart pounding, waiting for the familiar paralysis to grip me. And when it came, it was worse than before, more suffocating, more absolute. My body froze, and the heavy presence settled like a weight pressing down on my chest. Then, through the veil of my own mind, I saw him again. the faint outline of a man, just beyond the doorway, perfectly still, watching me. This time, though, something was different. His figure seemed sharper, more defined, like a shadow cut closer to reality. I tried to scream, to move, but the paralysis held me tight. And then I noticed something else, a small object in his hand, glinting faintly in the dim light. It looked like a key. Before I could make sense of it, I jolted awake, gasping for breath. Sarah was immediately at my side, flashlight in hand, eyes searching the room. "Did you see him again?" she asked quietly. I nodded, too shaken to speak. We checked the apartment together, every closet, every corner, every window. Nothing. But the unease lingered, thick and suffocating. The recorder was still on the nightstand. We played it back, expecting silence. Instead, just as the tape hissed and crackled, a faint whisper drifted through the speakers, almost indecipherable, but unmistakably a voice. "Find the key." Sarah and I exchanged a glance, the weight of those words settling over us like a shroud. There was no denying it now. This was no random nightmare or sleep disorder. Someone had been here. Someone who wanted something. And that key, they held it, waiting for me to wake. The question was, what did I need to find? And why? I realized then that the nightmare was only beginning. A sudden chill swept through the room as the speakers fell silent. Heart pounding, I reached for my phone, fingers trembling. The screen flickered, revealing a new message. "Look beneath the floorboards." We exchanged determined looks. There was no turning back now. Morning light crept through the slats of the blinds, tracing cold lines across my face and dragging me reluctantly out of a restless sleep. Sarah was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee, her eyes red-rimmed but alert. She looked up when I stumbled in, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "You okay?" she asked, voice low but steady. I swallowed, trying to make sense of the cloud of dread still clinging to me. "I don't know." Last night felt different. Like whatever is happening is getting closer. That key, the man held it. And that message on the phone. "Look beneath the floorboards." She nodded slowly. "We have to check it out." I can't stop thinking about that whisper on the tape. She tapped her fingers against the chipped mug. It wasn't random. Someone's trying to tell you something. I didn't argue. The idea of crawling under the floorboards in this drafty old apartment wasn't exactly comforting, but it was better than sitting here pretending none of this was real. We spent the morning trying to piece things together. The building was old, a relic from the 1920s, with creaky floors and peeling wallpaper. I'd lived here for 3 years and never thought much about the history, but now I was digging through old online records, hoping for a clue. Sarah watched over my shoulder while I scrolled through scanned newspapers and public records. "There's got to be something," I muttered, rubbing my temples. Eventually, I found an article from 1934 about a man named Charles Harlow who lived in this building. He'd been a locksmith and owned a small shop nearby. The article said he disappeared suddenly, no trace, no explanation. Rumors of foul play circulated, but nothing was ever proven. Sarah leaned in. A locksmith? That could explain the key. I nodded, heart pounding. If he was involved in something shady, maybe someone's still looking for what he left behind. We mapped out the apartment, focusing on the floorboards near the doorway where I'd seen the figure. The boards creaked underfoot, warped with age, but nothing looked out of place. Then Sarah pointed to a section near the corner, where the wood seemed newer, less worn. Could that be a hidden panel? I knelt down, running my fingers along the grain. There was a faint ridge, barely noticeable. Feels like it's loose. We grabbed a crowbar from the closet and worked cautiously, prying the board free. Dust billowed up, and I coughed, heart hammering in my chest. Underneath, a small cavity appeared, just big enough to fit a box. Inside was a rusty tin container, sealed tight. I lifted it up carefully, hands trembling. Sarah watched me, eyes wide. "Open it," she urged. I fumbled with the lid, the metal groaning as it gave way. Inside lay a folded piece of yellow paper, brittle with age, and a small, tarnished key, worn but unmistakable. My breath caught. This was it. I unfolded the letter slowly, the ink faded but legible. "To whoever finds this, beware the shadows that watch when you sleep. The key unlocks more than doors. Trust no one. Find the truth before it finds you." A chill ran down my spine. The words felt like a warning, but from whom? Charles Harlow? Or someone who'd come after him? The room seemed to close in around me. Sarah's voice broke through the silence. "This isn't just about sleep paralysis or nightmares. It's real. And it's dangerous." I looked at the key again, then at the note. The man I'd seen, the one holding the key, wasn't a ghost. He was someone alive, someone who'd been watching me all along. Suddenly, my phone buzzed on the table. Another message. I hesitated, then opened it. "You're closer than you think. Don't trust Sarah." The words hit me like a blow. I stared at Sarah, who was still watching me, concern etched on her face. "Did you send this?" I asked, voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes flashed with something I couldn't read. "No. I swear." For the first time since this nightmare began, doubt crept in. If I couldn't trust the one person who'd been by my side, who could I trust? The key lay heavy in my palm, a symbol of everything I didn't understand. Whoever was behind this was playing a deeper game, and I was right in the middle of it. And now, the stakes were higher than ever. I knew one thing for certain: there was no turning back. Whatever waited beyond this door was coming for me. And I had to find out what. Because if I didn't, if I failed, there wouldn't be another night to face. My hands trembled as I slid the key into the lock, the metallic click echoing eerily in the silent corridor. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room cluttered with papers, photographs, and a flickering computer screen. Shadows danced across the walls, cast by the weak glow of a single overhead bulb. Every detail screened secrets, fragments of a puzzle I hadn't even realized I was piecing together. I stepped inside cautiously, eyes scanning for anything that might explain the betrayal, the hidden agendas, or the identity of the puppet master pulling these strings. The air was thick with tension, as if the room itself was holding its breath. On the desk lay a worn journal, its pages filled with hasty notes and cryptic symbols. I flipped it open, heart pounding, searching for answers or perhaps a clue that might tip the scales in my favor. Suddenly, a soft beep from the computer made me freeze. A message appeared on the screen: "Welcome back. We've been expecting you." The words sent a chill down my spine. Someone had been watching, waiting for this moment longer than I thought. The game wasn't just about discovery anymore, it was about survival. And now, I was the prize. The dull hum of the computer filled the cramped room, its flickering screen casting shifting shadows across the walls. Outside, the hallway was silent, but the air felt thick, charged with something wrong. I glanced toward the door, half expecting to see that faint outline again, the man who haunted my sleep paralysis, waiting just beyond the threshold. But the corridor remained empty, swallowed by shadows. I didn't trust the silence. Not anymore. Sarah's words echoed in my mind: "Don't trust Sarah." At first, I wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, a cruel trick of my unraveling nerves. But the seed was planted, and it was growing fast. If she truly hadn't sent the message, then who had? And if there were others watching, how deep did this go? How much of my life had been bait in some twisted game? My fingers brushed over the journal's pages, scanning the scrawled notes again. They were fragmented, references to locations I didn't recognize, names I hadn't heard before. But one line caught my eye, underlined twice in red ink. They're closer than you think. Watch your back, especially at night. The handwriting was jagged, frantic. I closed the journal, heart pounding. I had to get out of the room, find Sarah, confront her. I had to know the truth. The hallway felt narrower than before as I stepped out, the key still heavy in my palm. I moved toward the stairs, each footfall echoing unnaturally loud. The house was too quiet. Too still. When I reached the landing, I heard a faint scraping sound coming from the living room below. My pulse quickened. I wasn't alone. Sarah? My voice trembled on the edge of a whisper. No answer. I crept down the stairs, trying to pinpoint the sound. It came again, soft, deliberate, like fingernails dragging across wood. I rounded the corner and froze. The front door was ajar, swinging slightly with the breeze. On the floor near the entrance lay scattered papers, photographs, maps, and printouts with markings I didn't understand. A sudden creak behind me spun me around. Shadows shifted near the staircase. My breath caught. Who's there? I demanded, voice cracking. A figure stepped into the dim light. It wasn't Sarah. He was tall, gaunt, with cold eyes that seemed to pierce through me. His face was unfamiliar, yet something about him resonated, a chill of recognition that I couldn't place. I've been waiting for you, he said quietly, voice low but steady. I backed away toward the stairs, heart hammering. What do you want? He smiled, a thin, humorless curve. To finish what was started. Before I could react, the front door slammed shut, the sound booming through the house. The man advanced, slow and deliberate, as if he knew I couldn't escape. Panic surged, but my legs refused to move. It was like the paralysis from my nightmares had spilled into waking life. I stumbled backward, desperate for the stairs, for an exit, for anything. The papers on the floor shifted as a breeze swept through the open door, revealing one photograph pinned beneath a stack, my face, circled in red. The man's gaze locked on it, then flicked up to me. You're the key. And the last piece. I swallowed hard, realizing this wasn't just about me being watched, it was about being hunted. The sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. Sarah's? Or someone else? The man's eyes narrowed. He's coming. We don't have much time. Before I could ask who, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. I was left with nothing but the pounding of my heart and the heavy presence of the man standing between me and escape. The nightmare I thought had been confined to my sleep was now very real, and it was closing in fast. And then, from the blackness, a voice whispered, familiar, terrified, run. But was it Sarah's warning or my own mind unraveling? I had to move. I had to survive. Because whatever waited beyond this door was no longer just a shadow in my dreams. It was a man standing in my home, and he was ready to act. The door behind me creaked again. The door behind me creaked again. My heart hammered so loud I was sure it would give me away, but I forced myself not to look back. Every instinct screamed to bolt, to find the nearest exit and never look back, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. The dim light barely cut through the suffocating darkness, but I could just make out the silhouette of the man shifting his weight, the scrape of his boots against the wooden floor echoing ominously. A gust of cold air swept past me, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and something metallic, blood. Panic surged anew, sharpening my senses. I scanned the room desperately, eyes searching for anything to use as a weapon, a chair, a lamp, even a heavy book. My hand closed around the cold metal handle of a nearby umbrella, the only thing within reach that felt solid enough to fend off an attacker. Slowly, I edged toward the narrow hallway leading to the back door. Each step was measured, silent, but the man's breath, ragged and uneven, was audible now, like a predator savoring the chase. The whisper echoed again, clearer this time, seated with urgency, "Run." I swallowed the lump in my throat and broke into a sprint, the umbrella raised defensively. The man lunged forward, crashing through a stack of boxes that tumbled noisily to the floor, shattering the fragile stillness. My pulse surged as I dodged left, the scrape of his fingers grazing past my arm. Outside, the street was deserted, bathed in the pale glow of the moon. I didn't hesitate. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning a protest, and spilled onto the cold pavement. Behind me, the man's curses pierced the night as he slammed the door shut. I didn't stop running until the comforting hum of streetlights and the distant sound of a passing car reminded me I was alive. But even as I put distance between myself and that nightmare, the whispered warning lingered. Was it a ghost? A premonition? Or a desperate plea from Sarah, echoing from beyond? All I knew was that I needed answers, and more than that, I needed to keep moving. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The sunlight filtered through the cracked blinds in ragged stripes, casting a harsh pattern across my bedroom floor. I hadn't slept well. Not since last night. Not since the moment I saw him standing in the doorway, just beyond the reach of the dim hallway light. The outline was faint, but it was unmistakable. A man, tall, motionless, waiting. Not a shadow or a trick of the dark. Real. Human. The heavy presence I'd felt every night during those episodes of sleep paralysis had finally taken shape, and it wasn't some figment of my imagination or a ghost story. It was something much worse. I sat up slowly, the sheets rustling beneath me. The umbrella lay discarded on the floor, a cold reminder of the narrow escape I'd made. Outside, the world was waking up, birds chirped, cars hummed, and the distant bark of a dog echoed down the street. Yet inside my own home, the silence felt suffocating. I ran a hand through my hair and exhaled deeply. Last night had been the breaking point. I couldn't live like this anymore, trapped between terror and paralysis, unsure of what was real and what was not. I needed to do something. Not just for the nightmares, but for myself. Around mid-morning, I forced myself outside. The air was crisp, the kind of clear morning that promised renewal, but the knot in my stomach refused to loosen. I walked the familiar path toward the local police station, the umbrella tucked awkwardly under my arm. Every step felt like wading through molasses, weighed down by dread and uncertainty. At the front desk, I explained everything as clearly as I could: my sleep paralysis, the presence, the man in my apartment. The officer listened with a polite but cautious expression, nodding slowly. I didn't blame her skepticism, it sounded insane. Like something out of a horror film. But when I mentioned the break-in, the scattered boxes, the footprints in the dust, her demeanor shifted. "Did you see him clearly? Could you identify him?" she asked. "No. Just the silhouette," I admitted. "But I know he's been in my place before. Probably watching me for some time." She scribbled something in her notebook. "We'll send a patrol by tonight. Maybe increase neighborhood watches. Do you have any idea who might want to do this?" I shook my head. "No enemies. No threats I can think of. It doesn't make sense." "Sometimes, it's not about sense," she said quietly. "It's about safety. We'll do what we can." I left the station feeling a little less alone, but the weight in my chest hadn't budged. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just a random intruder. He was deliberate, patient. And he was still out there. Over the next few days, I took precautions. changed my locks, installed a security camera pointed at the hallway. I slept with the door locked, the lights dim but on. I talked to my neighbor, Mrs. Green, who promised to keep an eye out, especially at night. And then, last night came again. I lay in bed, heart pounding, waiting for the paralysis to settle in, waiting for the presence to return. It did. The familiar heaviness pressing down on my chest, the inability to move, the cold sweat on my skin. But this time, I refused to be a passive victim. The silhouette appeared again, unmistakable and silent. But instead of sinking into panic, I forced my eyes to focus. I willed my body to fight. My fingers twitched, and then my hand moved slowly but deliberately toward the bedside lamp. I gripped the switch and flicked it on. The man's outline wavered at the sudden light, and for the first time, I saw more than just a shadow. I saw a face, gaunt, pale, eyes dark and unreadable. The features were familiar in a way that sent a fresh wave of horror through me. It was Mark. Mark, my ex-colleague. The one I distanced myself from months ago after things had gotten complicated. His obsession with me had been subtle at first, extra messages, showing up unexpectedly, but then it escalated to threats, stalking, and finally silence when I cut all contact. He had been the presence all along. I forced my body to move further, breaking free from the paralysis just enough to reach the phone on my nightstand. My fingers trembled as I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, a lifeline in the storm. There's someone in my apartment, I whispered, voice shaking but steady. Mark, he's here. I think he's been watching me. Stay on the line. Officers are en route. Can you move to a safe room? I climbed out of bed, every muscle aching from the tension, and slipped into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. The minutes stretched endlessly until the sound of sirens approached, cutting through the night like a sharp blade. When the police arrived, they found the door locked but no sign of forced entry. The security footage showed static interference during the night. Someone had tampered with the camera. But after an hour of searching, they found Mark hiding in the basement of my building, clutching a knife and a collection of my belongings, photos, notes, even a diary. He was arrested, and although the relief that followed was profound, the unease lingered. The man who haunted my nights was flesh and blood, not a nightmare or a ghost. The terror was real. But so was my survival. Weeks passed. I started therapy to untangle the trauma, to reclaim my nights from the paralysis and fear. I found strength in the small moments, morning light spilling over the windowsill, the warmth of a friend's hand on my shoulder, the steady beat of my own heart reminding me I was alive. I learned to sleep again, slowly but surely, without the darkness swallowing me whole. The heavy presence faded, replaced by the quiet hum of safety. I wasn't perfect, not yet, but I was no longer a prisoner of my own mind or the shadows that lurked beyond my doorway. Most of all, I learned to trust myself, to listen to that whisper of warning, that instinct to run, and to fight back when it mattered most. The man who haunted me was gone. But the story of that fear, of breaking free from paralysis and reclaiming my life, stayed with me. A dark chapter closed, yes, but one that taught me about courage, about survival, and about the fragile strength in simply waking up. I still keep the umbrella by my bed. Not because I expect the nightmare to return, but because it reminds me how far I've come. How I faced the darkness and, at last, stood tall against it. And that, I think, is the real victory. Story 4, False Neighbor, the subtle theft of trust. When the moving truck rolled down the street that Tuesday morning, I was sipping my usual black coffee on the porch, squinting against the weak spring sun. I hadn't expected much change when the new neighbor moved in. The lot next door had been empty for months, the grass a wild tangle of dandelions and clover, and the little brick house had been boarded up since last fall. But now there was a man unloading boxes, his dark hair curling messily at the nape of his neck, a steady smile that seemed to settle too easily on his face. He looked the kind of neighbor you'd expect to borrow sugar from, maybe stop by for a chat about the weather or a lost dog. His name was Mark, he said, when I introduced myself later that afternoon. He was polite, almost overly so, with a voice that carried a calm certainty. We exchanged pleasantries about the neighborhood, the slow return of spring, and the state of the local grocery store. When he asked if I needed anything, I laughed and said no, but thanked him anyway. He promised to keep the noise down during the renovation, which he said would take a couple of weeks. I figured the house next door was finally getting the attention it deserved. The first few days passed without incident. I went about my usual routine, mornings with coffee and the crossword, afternoons at the library or running errands, evenings watching old movies in the living room. Mark kept to himself mostly. Occasionally, I'd catch him pruning the rose bush that had strayed onto his side of the fence or hammering something inside the garage. He always waved when our eyes met, that same steady smile. It wasn't until Thursday night that I noticed something was off. I had just settled into bed, the soft hum of the ceiling fan above me and the distant call of a night bird outside my window. The house felt warm, the kind of warmth you don't think about until it's suddenly gone. I was halfway through a chapter of a novel when I realized a small glass jar on the nightstand, the one where I kept my reading glasses, was missing. I blinked. The jar was gone. It wasn't a valuable thing, just a cheap container I picked up at a thrift store, but it was mine. I scanned the room, half expecting it to be hiding behind a book or knocked off the edge of the table. Nothing. I even checked the floor, but the space was clear. I told myself I must have moved it earlier and forgotten. Maybe I'd set it down in the bathroom or kitchen. The next morning, I searched every plausible spot, but the jar was nowhere to be found. That same day, I went to make my usual cup of tea in the late afternoon. The box of tea bags was still on the counter, but the small tin of honey I kept beside it, the one I bought from that local farmer's market, was missing. I was sure I'd left it there the night before. I asked myself if I had absent-mindedly put it in the fridge or the pantry. I checked both. No honey. I shrugged it off, thinking I was probably just tired and forgetting where I placed things. I told myself I'd buy a new tin the next time I went out. But then, over the weekend, the oddities started stacking up. First, the kitchen scissors disappeared. Then my favorite blue mug with the chipped handle. Each time, I was certain I hadn't lent these items to anyone or moved them myself. I lived alone, and apart from the occasional visit from my sister, which hadn't happened in weeks, there was no one else with a key to my house. A knot of unease began to settle in my stomach. I tried to chalk it up to forgetfulness, maybe misplacing things during cleaning or moving them absent-mindedly. But the pattern was too strange to ignore. Things were vanishing, not just once but repeatedly, and always when I was at home. One afternoon, as I sat in the living room reading, I caught a glimpse of Mark through the window. He was kneeling near the fence, trimming the rose bush. His smile was there, calm and wide, but his eyes flicked toward my house for a moment longer than necessary. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. That evening, I locked the door carefully before going to bed, double-checked all the windows, and even placed my keys on the kitchen counter instead of my usual spot. I wanted to see if anything else would go missing. After a restless night, I woke to find my keys gone. I stared at the empty spot on the counter, heart pounding. No signs of forced entry. No broken locks. Nothing out of place except the absence of my keys. I called my sister immediately, her voice calm and steady on the other end. She told me not to jump to conclusions, that maybe I'd left them in my coat pocket or the car. I checked both. No keys. Later that day, I saw Mark again, this time walking past my porch with a bag slung over his shoulder. He paused, looked in my direction, and gave me that same easy smile. "Lost something?" he called out. I forced a smile, pretending that everything was fine, but inside, a cold dread was growing. It wasn't just sugar or a cup borrowed in passing. Something about him felt off, too practiced, too smooth. Like he was testing boundaries I hadn't even realized existed. I knew then that this was no coincidence. And I wasn't sure how far it would go. The morning after my keys disappeared was the hardest. I wanted to believe my sister was right, that maybe I was just being paranoid, but the unease had settled deep, like a slow poison. I didn't want to call the police just yet. What would I say? My neighbor stealing my things? It sounded absurd. But I couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. Something was wrong. I decided to take a day off from work and treat it like an investigation. First, I needed to catalog what had gone missing. I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and listed everything I could remember: the keys, my favorite wristwatch, the small wooden box of old letters, the packet of rare loose-leaf tea, a pair of headphones I used only when I ran. It was an odd collection, random at first glance, but none of it was valuable in the traditional sense. I thought of the letters, especially old birthday cards from my mother and a few postcards from my travels. Nothing anyone would sell or show off. It was as if the person who took them wasn't interested in money or status, but in possession, in control. I glanced out the window. Mark was still in his yard, trimming the rose bush. His smile was there again, bright and easy, but this time it felt less like a neighborly gesture and more like a deliberate signal. He caught my eye and gave a small nod before turning back to his work. I wanted to yell at him, to confront him, but the words stuck in my throat. That afternoon, I started going through my house with a new focus. I checked every drawer, every shelf, every corner where something might have been hidden or moved. Nothing new was missing, but I noticed something else, little changes that made me question how well I knew my own space. My coffee mug was never where I left it. Sometimes it was on the kitchen table, sometimes on the windowsill, sometimes even in the bathroom. I was sure I hadn't moved it. At first, I thought maybe I was just absent-minded, but the consistency made me pause. I found my phone charger unplugged and wrapped neatly on the bedside table. I never did that. I was always in a rush, leaving it tangled and plugged in until the last possible moment. My jacket was draped over a chair instead of hung on the hook. The mail I had brought in the day before was stacked upside down on the counter. These small details gnawed me. Whoever had access to my house was moving through it with an ease that suggested familiarity, too familiar. I started asking around, trying to learn more about Mark without making it obvious. I stopped by the local grocery store where I had seen him shopping once or twice. The cashier recognized him immediately. "Quiet guy," she said, "keeps to himself mostly. Moved in a few weeks ago. Works in construction, I think." That didn't surprise me. He seemed like the type to blend in, the kind of man who could slip under the radar without anyone noticing. But why was he so interested in me? That evening, I checked my locks again, turning the key slowly and listening for any signs of tampering. Nothing. The windows were all secured, no broken glass or forced entry. I even installed a small motion-activated light near the side door, hoping it might catch someone if they tried to sneak in again. After dinner, I sat on the porch with my laptop, trying to distract myself. The street was quiet except for the occasional car passing by. Mark's house was dark, the blinds closed tight. I wondered if he was watching me from behind those windows. Then, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Lost something else? My heart jumped. I stared at the screen, hands trembling. I didn't reply. Instead, I called my sister and told her everything. She was alarmed but told me to stay calm and document everything, including the message. I debated whether to go over and confront Mark, but the thought of facing that practiced smile made me hesitate. What if I was wrong? What if I was making a mountain out of a molehill? But the message, anonymous, direct, was a line crossed. Later that night, I lay in bed, the house dark except for the faint glow of the street lamp outside. I heard a soft noise, the scrape of a shoe on the porch, the faint click of the gate latch. My breath caught. I reached for the lamp on my nightstand, heart pounding. The front door remained locked. I didn't hear footsteps inside, but my mind raced through possibilities. Could Mark have a spare key? Had he been inside while I slept? The thought was terrifying. I pulled the covers tighter and stared at the ceiling, the silence pressing down on me. This wasn't just about missing things anymore. It was about my sense of safety, my control over my own life. And I had no idea how to take it back. The next morning, I found a note slipped under my door. No handwriting, just a simple message, scrawled in black ink. We're neighbors now. You don't have to be afraid. I didn't know whether to be reassured or terrified. But one thing was certain, this was far from over. I folded the note slowly, heart pounding. Questions swirled: who was watching, and why me? The uneasy truth settled in, my quiet life had shattered, and the pieces were nowhere near ready to fit back together. The morning light filtered through the half-closed blinds, casting thin stripes across the hardwood floor. I forced myself up, running a hand through my hair as I tried to shake the lingering chill. The silence in the house felt heavier than usual. Every creak and hum seemed amplified, as if the walls themselves were listening. I told myself to focus, to put the pieces together logically, but my thoughts kept circling back to Mark's smile, the locked door, the strange message on my phone. Everything was connected, but the how and why remained maddeningly out of reach. After a quick breakfast, I decided to check the house more thoroughly. The previous night's noises had unsettled me enough that I wanted to be sure no one had slipped in while I slept. I moved from room to room, examining drawers and cabinets, the backs of furniture, anywhere a person could hide something or leave a trace. That's when I noticed it, the subtle shift in the living room. The couch cushions were slightly askew. The small stack of magazines on the coffee table wasn't where I left it. A quick scan under the cushions revealed a folded piece of paper, its edges worn but unmistakably out of place. I unfolded it carefully. The paper was a page torn from a local newspaper's classified section, but someone had circled a single advertisement in red ink. Looking for reliable help. Flexible hours. Call for details. Beneath the ad, a phone number was hastily scribbled. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just a slip-up, it was a message meant for me or from me. But I had no memory of ever writing this, and I certainly hadn't called the number. The thought gnawed at me. Had Mark or someone else been inside, leaving this clue? Was I being lured into something? Or worse, was I being monitored so closely that my own handwriting was being forged? I pocketed the paper and stepped outside, glancing over at Mark's house. The blinds were still closed, but faint movement behind them suggested someone was up. I debated knocking, calling him out, demanding answers. But the memory of his smile, the way it never quite reached his eyes, stopped me. Instead, I decided to call the number on the paper. My hand trembled as I dialed, the phone pressed to my ear. It rang twice before a voice answered, calm, neutral, but with an edge that set my nerves on edge. Hello? I swallowed. I saw your ad, the one in the paper. There was a pause. And you're interested? I'm not sure. Can you tell me more? Help with personal things. Errands, small tasks. Flexible schedule, as the ad said. I hesitated, then said, "Who are you?" "Let's just say I'm someone who values discretion and efficiency," the voice replied. "If you want to know more, meet me tonight. Same time, your porch." The line went dead. A cold weight settled in my chest. This wasn't a casual job offer. It was a trap or a challenge. And it was tied to Mark, I was certain of it. The day dragged on, and I found myself unable to focus. Every sound outside made me jump. I kept checking my doors and windows, double locking them, moving cautiously through the rooms. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That my neighbor was stealing my things and sending cryptic messages? Without proof, I'd sound paranoid. As dusk fell, I prepared myself for the meeting. I told my sister about the call, and she urged me to be careful, to have someone with me if possible. But I insisted on going alone. I needed answers, and I wasn't about to let fear dictate my actions any longer. I settled onto the porch, the night air crisp against my skin. The street was quiet, the occasional glow of passing headlights casting fleeting shadows. I checked my phone, no new messages. After what felt like an eternity, footsteps approached. Soft, deliberate, measured. A figure emerged from the shadows, Mark. His smile was there, but tonight it felt different, less friendly, more knowing. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth. "I was wondering when you'd reply." "Who are you?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. He chuckled softly. "I've been here longer than you think. Watching. Helping, in my way." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "Why? Why take my things? Why send the messages?" "Because you weren't paying attention," he said, stepping closer. "Because you let your life get too predictable, too comfortable. I'm just shaking things up. Making you see." I shook my head, backing away. "You're not helping. You're invading." Mark's expression darkened for a split second before his smile returned, whiter and colder. "Invading? No, no. I'm integrating. You'll thank me one day." Suddenly, the lights in his house flickered on, illuminating the porch in stark white. Behind him, the windows revealed a room filled with photos, hundreds of pictures of me, my house, my routines pinned meticulously to the wall. I gasped, my heart pounding. "How long have you been doing this?" "Longer than you realize," he replied, stepping closer again, his voice low. "And now, you're part of the neighborhood. Part of my world." I stumbled back, my mind screaming to run, but my feet felt rooted. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a neighborly spat. It was something far more dangerous. And I was trapped in it. As Mark's smile stretched impossibly wide, the street lamp flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. The last thing I saw before the night swallowed us whole was the glint of something sharp in his hand. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for certain: my life had crossed a line. There was no going back. Morning came reluctantly, its pale light seeping through the slats of my blinds, but sleep remained stubbornly out of reach. Eventually, the dull ache of exhaustion pulled me from the bed, and I moved through the motions of the morning with a jittery kind of detachment. I ate cold cereal, stared blankly at the news on TV, and avoided looking out the window toward Mark's house. The blinds stayed tightly shut. But the silence of the house was deceptive. It felt too quiet, too empty, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I needed answers. I needed a plan. I pulled on a jacket and stepped outside, the air sharp and crisp. The neighborhood was waking up. Cars rolled by, neighbors watered their lawns, joggers passed on the sidewalk. Everything seemed normal, just as it had before Mark moved in. Except Mark's house was dark. No curtains drawn back. No sign of life. I hesitated, then made my way to his porch. The door was ajar. My heart slammed in my chest. I stepped inside without thinking. The interior was unnervingly spotless, too sterile to feel lived in. I flicked on the light switch, nothing. The place was unnervingly quiet, the faint smell of bleach and dust hanging in the air. I moved cautiously from room to room, the hairs on my arms standing on end. Then I saw it. On the kitchen counter, my favorite coffee mug. The one I'd been searching for nearly a week. Beside it, my keys. And the small stack of mail I'd missed in the chaos, my bank statements, a letter from work, and a package addressed to me. The realization crashed over me in waves. He had been inside my house. When? How? Why? I'd been so sure I was alone, so sure the locks were secure. Suddenly the front door slammed behind me. I spun around. Mark stood there, his smile stretched wide, but his eyes colder than ever. "Welcome to my home," he said softly, the words dripping with menace. A surge of panic seized me. "You can't just..." "Can't what?" he interrupted, stepping closer, his voice calm but laced with something dangerous. "Enter when I want. Borrow what I want. Take what I want. You forget, this isn't just your life anymore." I clenched my fists, trying to steady my voice. "You're sick. This isn't normal. You need help." He laughed then, a low, humorless sound. "Help? Maybe. But who's going to help you now? You've let me in, whether you realize it or not. And I don't plan on leaving." I backed toward the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The lock clicked into place. The house felt like a cage. Mark's grin widened. "See? This is just the beginning." I searched the room, desperate for anything, my phone, a window, a weapon. But all I had was the creeping realization that the man next door wasn't just some odd neighbor. He was a predator, and I was his prey. Then, from behind Mark, I caught sight of something new, a door I hadn't noticed before, slightly ajar. Beyond it, a dim light flickered. "Curious?" Mark's voice was a whisper now. "You'll want to see this." Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I followed him. The door led to a small basement room, walls lined floor to ceiling with more photographs, notes, and maps. Pins connected the dots between people, places, timelines. My name was circled in red, along with those of other neighbors I barely knew. "This," Mark said, sweeping his arm across the room, "is the story I'm writing. Your story. Our story." I swallowed the lump in my throat and took a step back, nearly knocking over a stack of papers. "Why me? Why us? What do you want?" "To make things better," he said, voice almost pleading. "To fix what's broken. You think your life is fine? Safe? Predictable? I'm giving you a chance to wake up." I shook my head, feeling tears sting the corners of my eyes. "This isn't waking up. It's a nightmare." Mark's expression softened for a moment, almost human. "Maybe. Or maybe it's the only way to survive." A sudden noise behind me made me whirl around. The basement door slammed shut. I was trapped. And then the lights went out. The darkness was absolute, swallowing us whole. I fumbled for my phone, but no signal. No help. Only the sound of Mark's breathing, steady and close. In that pitch-black room, with nowhere to run, I realized the depth of the trap I had fallen into. This wasn't just about missing things or stolen moments anymore. It was about control. My control. And Mark was ready to take it all. The last thing I heard before panic closed over me like a wave was his whisper, chilling and intimate. "You belong to me now." The weight of his words pressed down on me, suffocating and absolute. My heart pounded in my ears, each beat a frantic plea for escape that the darkness refused to grant. I could feel his presence, a shadow looming just beyond the thin veil of blackness, his breath hot against my skin despite the cold air. Fingers brushed my arm, gentle but possessive, reminding me that resistance was futile. Yet somewhere beneath the fear, a spark of defiance flickered. I clenched my fists, grinding my nails into my palms until the sting cut through the paralysis. This was not the end, not if I could help it. Somewhere in this abyss, I had to find a way out, to reclaim what was stolen. The silence stretched, broken only by the slow, deliberate ticking of time, each second a countdown to my next move. Mark's whisper echoed again, a sinister lullaby meant to break me, but I swallowed my terror and breathed deep. If he thought I was lost, he hadn't counted on the fury that desperation breeds. I was far from defeated. The basement door finally creaked open, and the sharp, sterile light from the hallway spilled into the darkness like a blade. As I emerged from the basement, the weight of the night pressed down on me like a physical force. The air smelled stale, thick with dust and something metallic I couldn't place. My hands shook, but I forced myself to stand tall. I had survived the trap. Now I needed to end it. I didn't speak. Mark said nothing either. His eyes flicked to the front door, then back to me, calculating. The silence between us was thicker than any words could be. Outside, the morning sun was just beginning to creep over the horizon, casting a pale glow across the neighborhood. It felt almost cruel, this light, so pure and hopeful after the suffocating darkness I'd endured. But I wasn't naive anymore. Light didn't wash away what had happened, nor did it erase the damage already done. I stepped past Mark and out onto the porch. The air was cool, and the birds were already beginning their morning chorus. I took a deep breath and let it fill my lungs, steadying myself. I had to move forward. The police report was filed that day. I told them everything, the missing items, the locked basement, the strange calls and visits, and the way Mark had tried to control me. Their faces were a mix of sympathy and skepticism, but they promised to investigate. Mark's name was out there now, tied to my account of events. I didn't know if that would stop him, but it was a start. In the days that followed, I stayed with a friend while the police searched my house. They found evidence items hidden in Mark's garage, some of my belongings carefully stashed away, and a journal filled with disturbing entries about control and ownership. It was worse than I had imagined, but at least the truth was out. Mark was arrested that week. His smile, once so disarming, was replaced by something brittle and defeated. I didn't cry when I heard. Instead, I felt numb, as if a part of me had been hollowed out. But beneath that numbness was relief. The nightmare was finally over. I returned to my home slowly, cautiously. The house felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like a battlefield. Every room held memories of fear and violation. But I was determined to reclaim it. I started with small things, cleaning, rearranging furniture, filling the empty spaces with light and warmth. It wasn't just about making the house livable again, it was about rebuilding myself. I realized that Mark's control wasn't just about the physical things he took or the moments he invaded, it was about the fear he planted deep inside me. And to move on, I had to uproot that fear. Therapy helped. Talking through the experience, unearthing the tangled emotions, and learning to trust myself again was hard, but necessary. I learned to recognize the subtle signs of manipulation and to set firm boundaries. I became vigilant not just about who I let into my life, but about how I allowed myself to be seen and understood. My relationship with my neighbors changed too. I became more cautious, less quick to accept friendliness without question. But I also found new connections, people who respected my space and who offered genuine kindness without expectation. It reminded me that not everyone wore a mask like Mark's. One afternoon, months later, I stood on my porch and watched the sun dip low behind the trees. The sky was streaked with orange and pink, a quiet promise of endings and beginnings. I thought about the person I had been before Mark moved in, the trusting, hopeful version of myself, and the person I was now, wary, scarred, but stronger. I understood something essential then. Survival wasn't about forgetting the darkness, it was about learning to carry the light through it. Mark's shadow might always linger in the corners of my mind, but it no longer held power over me. I had taken back my life, piece by piece, day by day. And in doing so, I had reclaimed my story. The doorbell rang that evening. My heart jumped, but I didn't freeze. I opened the door to find a neighbor I barely knew, holding a plate of cookies and a tentative smile. "Welcome back," she said softly. I smiled back, genuine this time, and invited her in. The past hadn't disappeared, but I was no longer its prisoner. The future was mine to shape, and for the first time in a long time, that felt possible. We settled into the worn sofa, the cookies between us on the coffee table, their sweet aroma filling the quiet room. Conversation flowed slowly at first, hesitant and careful, but gradually the walls I'd built around myself began to crumble. She spoke of small neighborhood happenings, of books she'd read, of her own struggles and triumphs. I listened, surprised at how much I longed for connection, for the simple comfort of shared experience. Outside, the sky darkened, stars blinking awake one by one, silent witnesses to this fragile new beginning. In that moment, I realized that healing wasn't a straight path but a mosaic of small acts, acceptance, kindness, courage that together formed something whole and strong. The past remained a shadow, yes, but now it served as a backdrop to the light I was learning to carry within me. As my neighbor left that night, promising to come by again soon, I felt a quiet hope settle deep in my chest. Life was no longer just something endured, it was something I could embrace. Story 5, Silent Pursuit, Unseen Footsteps in Woods. I had always found something almost sacred about the quiet of the woods, especially in a place as remote as the northern ridge of Pine Hollow. The path twisted and curled between towering pines and thick underbrush, the ground carpeted with damp needles and the occasional burst of wildflowers. Birdsong floated overhead, and a soft breeze stirred the branches. I kept a steady pace, the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel the only real noise besides the distant call of a woodpecker. I'd planned for a long hike, aiming to reach a ridge about 6 miles in, where the views opened up over the valley below. I liked to stop there, sit on the rocks, and let the silence settle around me like a cloak. For the first hour, everything felt exactly as it should. The trail was familiar, the rhythm of my steps steady. I passed a fallen log, its bark peeling in thick curls, and a cluster of moss-covered stones that always made me think of forgotten graves. I paused briefly to adjust my pack, breathing in the scent of pine sap and damp earth. The forest was alive, but it was a quiet, gentle life, nothing to hint at the unease that was beginning to creep in. It happened just past a fork in the trail where the path narrowed and the trees grew closer together, their branches knitting overhead. I stopped to check my map, pulling it from the inside pocket of my jacket. That's when I heard it, a set of footsteps, soft but deliberate, falling in time with my own. At first, I thought it might be a hiker catching up behind me. I listened, waiting for the crunch of boots on gravel to grow louder, but the sound held steady, matching my pace exactly. I looked back. Nothing. The trail was empty, the shadows between the trees undisturbed. A squirrel darted across the path, disappearing into the underbrush. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably just my imagination, or maybe the wind shifting fallen branches. Still, the feeling lingered, a prickling at the back of my neck, a tightening in my chest. I quickened my pace, trying to lose whatever it was. The footsteps came with me, relentless and unchanging. When I stopped, they stopped. When I started again, they matched my every move. My breath caught, and I scanned the trees, straining to see through the dense tangle of trunks and shadow. The forest seemed to hold its breath with me, the usual chorus of birds and insects suddenly muted. I clutched my hiking pole tighter, my knuckles whitening. The rational part of me fought to stay calm. Maybe it was another hiker, maybe a jogger who had taken the same path. But the remote nature of the trail, the lack of any other signs of life, made that explanation feel thin. Whoever it was, they knew the trail and they were keeping pace deliberately, almost like they were waiting for the right moment. I debated turning back, but the thought of retracing my steps with that unseen presence behind me was worse. Instead, I veered off the path slightly, pushing through a thicket of brambles and low branches. The footsteps faltered for a moment, then resumed, still synchronized with mine, as if the person was unbothered by the rougher terrain. My heart hammered in my chest. I told myself to breathe, to think. I thought about the stories you hear sometimes, people disappearing in the woods, hikers who never make it back. Usually, those stories felt distant and far-fetched. Now, they felt alarmingly real. I stopped again, crouching behind a thick pine trunk, listening. The footsteps stopped too, just on the other side of the tree line. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig. Whoever it was, they weren't moving away. They were waiting. I checked my watch. I'd been on the trail for nearly 2 hours. The sun was climbing higher, but the dense canopy filtered the light into a dull green gloom. Shadows stretched long, and the forest felt colder, less welcoming. I considered yelling, but the sound seemed swallowed by the trees. Instead, I slipped my phone out, hoping for a signal. Nothing. Not even the faintest bar. The isolation that had seemed so peaceful now felt like a trap. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I had to move, had to find a way out of this. But as I stepped back onto the trail, the footsteps resumed, matching my every move, quiet but insistent. And then I realized something far more chilling. No one called out, no voice, no rustle of a figure moving through the underbrush, only the footsteps, always in time, always just behind me. It was as if someone was stalking me, using the shadows and the dense forest to close in unseen. The woods around me, which had felt so familiar, suddenly transformed into a labyrinth of suspicion and fear. I wasn't alone here. And whoever was out there wasn't lost. They were hunting. My breath quickened, each step heavier than the last, but the footsteps persisted, steady, unwavering. Panic clawed in my chest as I darted between trees, desperate for a hiding place. Then, just as abruptly as they had begun, the footsteps stopped. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. I dared to glance over my shoulder, but saw nothing but empty shadows stretching into the night. A faint rustle to my right snapped me back, and I pressed myself against the rough bark, heart hammering. Something moved, something deliberate. The hunt was far from over. I stayed pressed against the tree for what felt like forever, heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. After several minutes, I eased away from the trunk and crouched down to catch my breath. My mind raced, trying to piece together what I was dealing with. Whoever or whatever was out here wasn't just wandering lost. They were deliberately trailing me, matching my pace, stopping when I stopped. It wasn't an accident. It was stalking. I glanced down the trail, the narrow path twisting away between towering pines and thick ferns. The sun was dipping lower, the filtered light now dimming to a muted gray. I knew I couldn't stay put much longer. I had to keep moving, but every step felt heavy, waited with dread. Then my eyes caught something on the ground just off the trail, a thin strip of torn fabric snagged on a bramble, frayed and stained with dirt. I reached down carefully and picked it up. The material was coarse, a dark green that blended perfectly with the woods. I didn't recognize it from my own clothes. Whoever had been here wasn't just passing through, they had prepared, dressed to disappear into the forest. My mind flicked back to the footsteps, always just behind me, always silent but deliberate. Whoever this was had been close enough to brush against the bushes, close enough to lose a piece of clothing without noticing, or maybe they didn't care. Either way, it was proof. They were near, watching, waiting. I stuffed the fabric into my jacket pocket and stood up, scanning again for any sign of movement. The trail stretched ahead, winding deeper into the forest. I debated whether to backtrack, but something told me that wasn't safer. The woods behind me were just as dense, just as dark. And I had no idea where this person might be hiding. As I moved forward, I tried to quiet my breathing and slow my steps, hoping to confuse whoever was following me. But the footsteps started again, light and rhythmic, keeping pace no matter what I did. It was maddening, like the forest had its own heartbeat, matching mine, echoing in the undergrowth. My phone was still dead. No signal, no hope for a call. I cursed myself for not telling anyone where I was going. My sister, Emily, had begged me to hike with her, but I'd insisted on going alone. Now, that stubbornness felt like a cruel joke. I reached a small clearing where the trees opened up to a patch of mossy ground and a shallow stream. The light here was a little brighter, and I slowed, hoping the open space might give me a better view and maybe a chance to spot my stalker. I crouched and ran my fingers through the soft moss, trying to clear my head. Then I noticed footprints in the damp earth near the water, 2 sets. One was mine, of course, but the other was different. Larger, heavier, with a distinctive tread pattern, deep, wide grooves that suggested sturdy boots, not hiking shoes. I followed the prints with my eyes, tracing them back into the trees. They weren't fresh, perhaps several hours old, but they confirmed what I already feared. This person had been here long before me, watching, waiting. I felt a cold wave of panic rising again. I needed to find a way out, or at least a safer place to hide until I figured out my next move. But the forest seemed endless, a maze of shadows and silent threats. Then, something else caught my attention. Near the edge of the clearing, partially hidden beneath a fallen log, was a small object, something dark and metallic. I edged closer, heart hammering. It was a pocket knife, its blade folded, the handle scratched and worn. I picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of it in my hand. Why would someone leave a knife here? Was it dropped in a struggle? Or was it a message, a warning? I slipped the knife into my jacket pocket, next to the fabric. 2 pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve but couldn't ignore. The footsteps resumed suddenly, closer this time, sharper against the soft earth. I spun around, searching for any sign of movement in the trees. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, suffocating. I forced myself to move, stepping back onto the trail, head low, eyes darting. I needed to keep going, to find a ranger station or any sign of other people. But as I walked, I noticed the trail forked ahead, 2 narrow paths, both disappearing into thick woods. I hesitated, torn between instinct and fear. One path looked more worn, the other overgrown. I chose the worn trail, hoping it led somewhere familiar. But as I took the first few steps down the new path, the footsteps stopped again. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. Then, from somewhere just beyond the trees, a faint whisper reached my ears, a deliberate sound, too quiet to make out words but clear enough to shatter the fragile calm. I froze. The stalker was still here, still close, and this time, they wanted me to know it. I swallowed hard and pressed on, every nerve screaming. Because now, I wasn't just being followed. I was being hunted. And I had no idea who or what was waiting for me in the shadows just beyond the next bend. My heart pounded as the whisper grew louder, twisting through the night like a sinister promise. Each step forward felt heavier, burdened by unseen eyes tracking my every move. The whisper had stopped as abruptly as it began, swallowed by the thick hush of the forest night. I forced myself to move forward, slow and deliberate steps, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the trees. The trail bent sharply ahead, disappearing into a squeeze of shadows and thick underbrush. My heart slammed against my ribs like a warning drum. I wanted to turn back, to retrace my steps to the clearing where I'd found the knife. But something inside me, call it stubbornness or the last flicker of hope, pushed me onward. The forest seemed to close in with every step. The trees leaned in, their branches scratching against each other like whispered conspiracies. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the only movement was the occasional flicker of leaves stirred by the night breeze. The footsteps had stopped again, but the silence was too complete to feel safe. Then, a sudden sound shattered the stillness, a sharp snap, like a twig breaking underfoot. My breath caught, and I spun around. Nothing. No figure, no shadow, just the empty trail stretching back the way I'd come. But my skin prickled, the sensation of ice burning into my back. I forced myself to keep moving. The trail narrowed, the underbrush thickening until I had to brush branches aside with my hands. Every rustle sounded like a threat. Somewhere deep in the woods, a bird cried out, a harsh, unnatural sound that made me jump. I was on edge, every nerve screaming, when I noticed something strange about the trail itself. The dirt was damp, but here and there were patches of dark, sticky-looking spots too dark to be just mud. I crouched down, shining my phone's weak flashlight on the ground. The spots glistened faintly in the beam. Blood. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just a random hunting game. Someone had been injured or worse. And they were close. I debated what to do. Follow the trail back to the clearing? Keep going forward? The knife felt heavier now, a silent promise that I wasn't helpless. But I knew this forest well enough to know that blood this fresh meant the danger was near and real. I pressed onward, following the trail of stains like a grim breadcrumb path. The woods closed tighter around me, branches snagging in my clothes, the undergrowth thickening until I was practically crawling. The faint moonlight barely pierced the canopy. Then, just as I rounded a bend, I saw it, a small clearing, barely wide enough to stand in. And there, lying half-hidden beneath a thicket of ferns, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a deer, something caught and struggling. But as I stepped closer, the shape shifted. A man. His clothes were torn, his face pale and twisted in pain. His breathing was shallow, ragged. I didn't recognize him, no backpack, no gear, just a filthy jacket and muddy jeans. "Hey," I said quietly, kneeling beside him. "Are you okay?" "What happened?" He blinked up at me, eyes glazed with exhaustion and fear. "Help, please," he croaked, clutching his side where a dark stain spread across his jacket. My mind raced. Was this the stalker? Another victim? Or someone else entirely, trapped in whatever nightmare this forest had become? "I'm going to help you," I said, fumbling for my first aid kit in my pack. I tore a strip from my shirt to make a makeshift bandage. As I worked, the man's eyes flickered with recognition. They're out there. Watching. Waiting. "Who?" I asked, voice low, urgent. He coughed, a wet, choking sound that made me flinch. "The ones who don't want us to leave." I froze. The words echoed in my mind, chilling in their simplicity. This wasn't random. It was deliberate. And I was caught in the middle. Suddenly, movement flickered beyond the clearing's edge, a shadow slipping behind a tree. My head snapped up, heart hammering. The man's eyes widened, terror flooding his face. "They're here," he whispered. I grabbed his arm, trying to pull him to his feet. "We need to move. Now!" But before we could take a step, a sharp crack rang out, a gunshot. The man yelped, collapsing back to the ground. Pain exploded across my chest like a physical blow. I stumbled, the knife in my pocket digging into my side as I fell forward. The forest erupted into chaos. Leaves rustled violently, branches cracked, and the faint sound of footsteps, many footsteps, closed in from all directions. I looked up, desperate for a way out, but the woods were alive with shadows, circling, waiting. And then I saw it, a faint glow, just beyond the trees, a flashlight beam sweeping through the darkness, hunting. I wasn't alone in this forest. And I was running out of time. Pain flared sharply where the knife pressed against my ribs, but panic drowned it out. I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering as the glowing beam edged closer. The shadows shifted, twisting into forms, figures, maybe, or something else. I forced myself to move, limbs heavy, lungs burning, driven by the cold thrum of fear. If those footsteps belonged to hunters, then I had a chance. If not... I swallowed hard, tightening my grip on the knife. The flashlight's beam swept past me, narrowly missing. I ducked behind a gnarled oak, breath ragged, waiting. Whatever came next, I had to be ready. The forest was no longer just a backdrop to my nightmare, it had become the prison itself. I dared not look back. But every instinct screamed that I should. The man lay sprawled where he'd fallen, his ragged breaths barely audible beneath the chorus of the woods. I hadn't had time to help him, not really, but I couldn't leave him. Not yet. Yet the shadowy figures were closing in, whispers of movement threading through the underbrush like poisonous vines tightening their grip. I had to keep moving. A sudden snap to my left made me whip around. No flashlight beam this time, just the silhouette of a figure stepping out from behind a tree. I froze, breath caught in my throat. The figure halted, hand raised, then lowered. A voice, low and urgent, whispered, "You don't have much time." "Who are you?" I hissed, trying to steady my shaking hands. "Are you one of them?" "No," he replied quickly, "but I've been watching. They're not hunters. There's something worse. They want to keep the forest sealed off. No one leaves once they're inside." I wanted to ask more, but the sound of multiple footsteps approaching interrupted us. The man glanced toward the noise, eyes sharp and calculating. "Come with me." I hesitated, torn between instinct and the grueling weight of exhaustion. But what choice did I have? The flashlight beam was growing louder, a cold spotlight creeping ever closer. I nodded, gripping the man's arm as we ducked behind a fallen log. "We have to move fast," he said, voice barely above a breath. "They're closing the perimeter." The words made my skin crawl. This wasn't random violence or a lost hunter's paranoia. It was organized, methodical. A trap. We slipped through the tangle of undergrowth, the man leading with a practiced surety I envied. But even with his guidance, my legs felt heavy, my balance precarious. The pain in my side flared sharply with every step, and I swallowed bile that rose in my throat. "What are they?" I asked, voice strained. "People," he answered grimly. "Locals. Some kind of militia or cult. They believe the forest belongs to them, that outsiders bring danger. When they catch you, they punish." I shuddered. Punish. The word echoed like a death knell in my mind. Suddenly, The beam of the flashlight appeared again, carving a bright arc through the trees. We pressed ourselves flat against the earth, breath freezing in our lungs as the light swept perilously close. The footsteps multiplied, voices now, low and threatening, murmuring in a language I didn't understand. "They're speaking in code," the man whispered. "They know we're close." Panic surged. I knew I couldn't outrun them. But maybe, just maybe, I could outthink them. "Is there a way out?" I asked, voice barely audible. He shook his head. "The old logging road, maybe. But it's heavily guarded. We'll have to be smart." We moved again, slower this time, inching through the dark like ghosts. The man's hand gripped mine tightly, a lifeline in the chaos. Then, a sudden crack, branches snapping under heavy boots, and the flashlight swung toward us again. "They're right behind us." I hissed, heart hammering. The man pulled me into a small hollow between two rocks, barely big enough for us both. We crouched, bodies pressed together, breath mingling in the cold air. The figures passed by, voices rising in anger, frustrated shouts piercing the night. I closed my eyes, counting my breaths, willing my pulse to slow. When the footsteps finally faded, I peeked out. The forest seemed to hold its breath in the silence. "We can't stay here," the man said. "Not safe." I nodded, despite the pain and the exhaustion that threatened to swallow me whole. We crept forward again, skirting the edge of a small creek. The water's faint murmur was a balm to my frayed nerves. I bent to cup some in my hands, the cold shocking against my feverish skin. "Why are they doing this?" I asked quietly. "Why keep people trapped?" He looked at me then, eyes dark and haunted. "Because the forest hides secrets. Secrets they want to protect at any cost." I swallowed hard. The weight of his words settled over me like a shroud. Suddenly, a twig snapped behind us. I spun, knife flashing in the moonlight, but the figure that emerged was not one of the hunters. It was a woman, her face pale and drawn, eyes wide with fear. "Please," she whispered, voice trembling. "You have to help me. They took my brother." Before I could respond, the flashlight beam cut through the trees again, closer than ever. "They're coming back," the woman said, panic rising in her voice. "We have to move. Now." I glanced at the man, whose jaw clenched. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about fighting back and maybe, just maybe, finding a way out of the darkness that had swallowed us whole. But as we scrambled to our feet and plunged deeper into the forest, a sudden, searing pain exploded in my side. I staggered, vision blurring, and heard a voice, cold, cruel, echo through the trees. "Got you now." The last thing I saw was the flashlight beam locking onto me, and then everything went black. When I awoke, the forest was silent except for distant footsteps. The fight wasn't over, far from it. My head throbbed, and my limbs felt heavy as if weighted down by shadows themselves. I forced my eyes open, squinting against the dim light filtering through the canopy. The cold earth beneath me was damp, and a fresh sting radiated from my side where the pain had flared before. Panic clawed at my chest, but I pushed it down. I needed to move, to find a way out. The footsteps had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness that pressed in from all sides. Somewhere nearby, a faint rustling betrayed the presence of others, enemies, friends, or something else entirely. I couldn't tell. Gritting my teeth, I dragged myself up, ignoring the sharp ache with each breath. The forest around me seemed alive, shadows twisting between the trees like tendrils reaching for me. Steeling myself, I stepped forward, every sense alert. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The cold bit deep into my ribs as I pushed through the undergrowth, every step a painful reminder of the wound that throbbed relentlessly on my side. Somewhere nearby, a faint rustle broke the stillness. My heart hammered against my chest like a desperate drum. I crouched behind a fallen log, breath shallow, the knife still clenched in my trembling hand. The footsteps were hesitant this time, uneven, as if whoever they belonged to was injured or uncertain. I swallowed hard and forced my body to stay still. A figure emerged, limping but unmistakably human. It was the woman, the same pale, haunted face from before. Her eyes locked onto mine, wide with terror and relief all at once. I motioned for her to be quiet, and she nodded, her lips trembling. She leaned in, whispering, "We can't stay here. They're close, and they're haunting us." I nodded, swallowing past the sharp sting in my throat. Despite the pain, I scrambled to my feet, the woman supporting herself on a tree trunk nearby. "What happened to your brother?" I asked, voice rough. "They took him," she said, voice barely audible. "They dragged him deeper into the woods toward the old ranger station. It's the only place they can hold him without being seen." The ranger station. I remembered a faint path branching off somewhere to the east, marked on the map I'd studied before the hike. It was abandoned and forgotten, overgrown with moss and thorns. If they'd taken her brother there, it meant they had a base, a hideout. And if we wanted to get out of this alive, we had to go there, and fast. I glanced down at my side. The blood was seeping through my shirt, but adrenaline masked the worst of the pain. "We'll find him," I promised. "But we need to move now." We set off, moving carefully, every snapped twig or crack of a branch making my pulse spike. The woman's breathing was shallow. She was clearly exhausted and scared, but there was a fierce determination in her eyes. I realized then that we were both fighting for something bigger than ourselves, not just survival, but justice, maybe even redemption. The forest grew thicker, the underbrush tangled like a trap. I stumbled more than once, the wound flaring with each misstep, but I refused to give in. Every step brought us closer to that ranger station, and I could almost feel the weight of those unseen eyes tracking us, closing in. Suddenly, a sharp cry cut through the air, a sound that wasn't quite human, not quite animal. It was the woman's brother. My heart jumped. We hurried toward the voice, pushing through the thorns and dead leaves, until the ranger station came into view, a small, dilapidated cabin half swallowed by vines and rot. Shadowed figures moved near the door, 3 men, their faces obscured by hats and scarves, armed with flashlights and something heavier in their hands. The woman grabbed my arm, her grip icy. "We can't just storm in," she whispered. "We need a plan." I scanned the area quickly, noting a narrow window on the side of the cabin. It was cracked open just enough for a person to squeeze through. "We distract them," I said, "and then slip in through the window. I'll try to get your brother out." She nodded, eyes fierce with gratitude. "I'll create the distraction." She slipped away silently, melting into the shadows like a ghost, while I crouched low, waiting for her signal. Minutes stretched like hours. Then, suddenly, the night exploded with a shout and the sharp crack of a thrown rock. The men turned, shouting and shining flashlights toward the sound. I moved. The cut window was just within reach. I scrambled through, landing hard on the wooden floor inside. The cabin smelled of mildew and something sour, fear, maybe, or sweat. I crept forward, the beam from their flashlights slicing through the darkness as the men fumbled outside, calling after the woman. In the back room, I found him, the woman's brother, tied to a chair, bruised and barely conscious. Relief flooded me, but it was tempered by the urgency pressing down like a weight. I cut the bindings quickly, helping him to his feet. "Quiet," I whispered. "We're getting out." The 3 men were still distracted outside, their voices growing angrier. We slipped out the same way I'd come in, careful to stay low, but as we reached the edge of the cabin, a voice barked behind us. Stop. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, lunged forward. Instinct took over. I grabbed a heavy branch nearby and swung it with everything I had. It connected with a sickening crack, and the man staggered back, clutching his face. This was our chance. We ran. Branches whipped against my face and arms, the pain in my side now a roaring inferno. Behind us, the shouting grew frantic, footsteps pounding the earth. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The forest seemed endless, but after what felt like an eternity, we burst out onto an old logging road. Headlights cut through the dark, 2 trucks and a police car. The officers jumped out, weapons drawn, eyes scanning the woods. "Over here," the woman cried, waving frantically. We collapsed onto the gravel, gasping for breath. The officers moved quickly, securing the area and calling for backup. The men were caught, cornered in the woods, their hunt ended. As I sat on the cold ground, the woman beside me clutching her brother close, the weight of everything I'd been through finally began to lift. I looked down at my bloodied side, the pain still there but fading into the background. I was alive. We were alive. In the days that followed, the story unfolded in the news, an illegal hunting ring operating deep in the forest, preying on anyone who dared to wander alone. The woman and her brother found safety, and I was hailed as a witness and survivor. But the real victory was quieter. I wasn't the same person who had set out on this hike. The fear, the pain, the shadows that had chased me, they left scars, yes, but they also left something else, strength. I learned that survival wasn't just about running or hiding, it was about facing the darkness head-on, finding allies in unexpected places, and refusing to be broken. The forest still holds its secrets, and the memory of those nightmarish hours lingers. But now, when I walk beneath the trees, I carry with me a hard-earned peace. A knowledge that even in the deepest dark, the human spirit can fight back, and sometimes, just sometimes, it wins. And that made all the difference. Story 6, Silent Pursuer, Footsteps Without a Shadow. I had never been much of an outdoors person, but that morning I found myself lacing up my worn hiking boots with a kind of quiet determination. I wasn't running from anything in particular, just from the noise of my own life, the endless chatter of a city that never seemed to pause, the buzz of emails and phone calls, the constant hum of expectations. The woods, I thought, would be different. Here, I could walk and breathe and maybe find a moment of silence that wasn't filled with the static of my own racing thoughts. The morning air was crisp, the kind that carries a faint hint of pine and damp earth. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in mottled patches, casting long shadows that shifted with the breeze. I stepped onto the narrow dirt path, the ground soft beneath my boots, and started walking. The trail wound gently upward, bordered by ferns and wildflowers, their colors muted but alive. Birds flitted between branches, their calls distant and soothing. For the first hour, everything felt as it should. My breath found a steady rhythm, my legs moved with purpose, and the forest wrapped around me like a quiet embrace. I passed a fallen log covered in moss, paused to admire the way a squirrel darted away at my approach, and even caught sight of a pair of deer slipping silently through the underbrush. These were the small, unspoken gifts of the wilderness, the moments that made the effort worthwhile. Then, just as I rounded a bend where the trail narrowed sharply, I heard it, footsteps. Soft, deliberate. Not ahead of me, not behind me, but somewhere close, just out of sight. I stopped and listened. My heart picked up, but I told myself it was probably another hiker, maybe a couple of minutes behind. The park was popular enough for that. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. The trail was empty except for the dappled light and the shifting leaves. I called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" My voice felt strange in the quiet, too loud in the stillness. No reply. I started walking again, slower this time, my ears straining. The footsteps resumed, matching mine, step for step. When I sped up, they did too. When I stopped, they did as well. A cold knot twisted in my stomach. I dared to glance behind me once more. The woods were empty. No figure, no shadow, just a dense thicket of trees and undergrowth. But the footsteps, those unmistakable echoes, continued, relentless and in perfect sync. I tried to convince myself it was an animal or some trick of the ear. Maybe a deer stepping carefully on dry leaves, or a coyote padding nearby. But the pattern was too precise, too human. The trail ahead began to narrow even further, the trees growing closer together, their branches tangled and low. The sunlight dimmed as the canopy thickened. The air grew cooler, damp with the scent of moss and rot. My pace slowed, caution creeping into every step. I reached another bend, heart hammering now, and stopped once more. The footsteps stopped too. I held my breath, waiting, listening. But the forest swallowed the sound, leaving only the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a hidden bird. I glanced behind me again. Nothing. No movement. No sign of anyone. Yet the feeling persisted, someone was there, just beyond sight, watching and following, silent as the shadows. The thoughts settled deep, cold and unshakable. I was now alone on this trail. And whoever or whatever was behind me, they didn't want to be seen. I took a deep breath and started walking again, every muscle tense, eyes flicking nervously to every dark corner in the woods. The footsteps began again, slow and measured, never faltering, the sound of someone tracking me in perfect, eerie rhythm. I knew then that this hike was no longer about finding peace. It was about getting out. Branches cracked sharply behind me, the sound slicing through the night air like a warning. I froze, heart hammering, every instinct screaming to bolt, but my legs refused to move. The footsteps paused too, as if whoever or whatever was following me had sensed I was aware. A rustle to my right. I swung my flashlight beam in that direction, the sickly yellow light cutting through the shadows. For a moment, nothing but swaying leaves and empty darkness. Then, a low, guttural growl vibrated through the trees, rough and primal. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled back, tripping over a root, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and plunging everything into blackness. Panic surged, a raw, cold wave. I fumbled blindly, fingers brushing wet leaves and cold bark, trying to find the flashlight before whatever was out there closed the distance. "Who's there?" My voice cracked, barely more than a whisper, but it seemed to hang in the stillness like a challenge. Silence answered. Then the footsteps resumed, closer now, crunching on dead leaves with deliberate care. I could hear the ragged breathing, uneven and shallow. It was no human, no sane human breathing like that. I scrambled upright, dialing my phone with shaking hands. No signal. Nothing but the dead silence of the forest and those relentless, measured footsteps shadowing my path. Desperation clawed at me. I needed a plan, somewhere to hide, a place to disappear. Ahead, the faint glow of a creek caught my attention. Water attracts animals, but it might also offer a chance to mask my scent, to throw off whatever was hunting me. I moved as quietly as I could, every step weighted with caution. The footsteps kept pace, never rushing, never losing me. Every now and then, I thought I glimpsed a shape between the trees, a flash of movement too quick to be human, yet too purposeful to be wild. When I finally reached the edge of the creek, the moonlight shimmered on the water, casting pale reflections. I crouched low, dipping my hands into the cold flow, splashing some over my face to steady my nerves. Behind me, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, a whisper brushed my ear, so faint I thought my mind was playing tricks. "You can't run." I spun around, heart in my throat, but only the empty woods stared back. The hunt was far from over. The creek's cold water did little to wash away the sense of dread that had settled deep in my bones. When I finally forced myself to stand, my legs stiff and trembling, the moon had climbed higher, casting silver light over the narrow trail that wound away from the creek. I had to keep moving. Staying put felt like inviting whatever was out here to finish the hunt. I gripped the flashlight tighter this time, careful not to drop it again, and started along the path. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the twisted roots and patches of moss that marked the forest floor. The trail was narrower now, the trees closing in like silent sentinels. The air smelled damp and earthy, thick with the musk of decay. Every snap of a twig underfoot or rustle in the brush made me flinch. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone lurking just beyond the edge of the light. But there was nothing. Just the forest, indifferent and endless. Still, the footsteps came back. Not the heavy, ragged breathing from before, but something lighter, soft steps, mirroring mine exactly. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they moved. It was like a twisted game of follow the leader, and I was losing. I tried calling out again, voice steadier this time. "Who's there? Show yourself." The echo of my words bounced between the trunks, but no answer came. Only the footsteps, steady and patient, closing the distance inch by inch. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. There had to be a person behind this, someone watching me, stalking me through the trees, skilled enough to stay hidden but close enough to make me feel their presence. The idea chilled me more than any shadow. This was no random animal. This was something deliberate. Something human. I remembered the stories I'd heard about this forest, hikers going missing, strange sightings, warnings passed down like campfire tales. I'd brushed them off as folklore, but now they felt all too real. I wasn't just lost, I was being hunted. The flashlight beam caught something near the base of a tree, an old, tattered piece of fabric snagged on a branch. I crouched down, heart pounding, and pulled it free. It was faded green, like camo, but worn thin. Someone had been here recently. That much was clear. I stuffed the fabric into my pocket, a grim reminder that I wasn't alone. The footsteps quickened, then slowed, as if the person was deliberately playing with me. I debated running but knew it would only make me easier to track. Instead, I tried to steady my breathing, focusing on the sounds around me. Suddenly, the trail opened into a small clearing. Moonlight spilled over a circle of moss-covered stones, ancient and weathered. I stepped into the center, feeling exposed but desperate for any sign of what was following me. Then I saw it, footprints pressed into the soft earth, too large and heavy to be mine. They led around the clearing, circling me like a predator sizing up its prey. I traced the prints with my flashlight, heart hammering. They were fresh. Whoever was out here wasn't just stalking me, they were toying with me, marking their territory, making sure I knew they were close. A cold wind whispered through the trees, carrying a faint, acrid smell, smoke, maybe, or something burnt. I scanned the tree line and spotted a thin wisp rising behind some thick underbrush. A fire? Campsite? Someone was making a base out here, hidden in the dark. I debated heading toward the smoke but knew it could be a trap. Instead, I turned back toward the trail, trying to keep calm, to stay one step ahead. The footsteps resumed immediately, softer now but relentless. Then, just as I rounded a bend, the beam of my flashlight caught a figure, a blur between two trees. I froze, heart in my throat. The shape melted into the darkness before I could get a clear look. No face, no voice, just a fleeting shadow. The footsteps stopped again, but this time they were accompanied by a low, deliberate breath, close enough that I could almost feel the heat. My grip tightened on the flashlight, knuckles white. Why are you following me? I whispered, voice trembling. No answer. Just the rustling leaves and the heavy, watchful silence. I knew I couldn't stay out here much longer. The sun was gone, and the forest was closing in, alive with unseen eyes. Whoever this was, they wanted me scared. They wanted me alone. And they were good at it. A sudden crack echoed behind me, branches breaking underfoot, and I spun around, flashlight sweeping wildly. Nothing. Just the forest, endless and watching. But the footsteps had stopped. For now. I swallowed hard, forcing my breathing to steady as the cold pressed against my skin. My fingers tightened around the flashlight, its beam piercing the dark like a fragile lifeline. Somewhere in the shadows, a faint whisper drifted, no words, just a breath carried by the wind. I dared not follow it, yet couldn't turn away. Every instinct screamed to run, but my feet felt rooted, caught between fear and curiosity. Somewhere deeper in the woods, the silence shifted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. A soft rustle nearby made my heart skip, shadows twisting closer. The rustle came again, sharper this time, like dry leaves crushed beneath careful footsteps. I forced my legs forward, stepping gingerly on the uneven path. The trail had narrowed even more since the last bend, the trees crowding in like silent sentinels. The canopy was thick, allowing only faint slivers of moonlight to break through. My flashlight's beam bobbed with each step, illuminating tangled roots and brittle leaves that crunched underfoot. Then the footsteps returned, soft, deliberate, always just behind me. I stopped abruptly, heart hammering so loud I wondered if whoever was there could hear it. Silence. No breath. Nothing but the night and the steady pulse of my own fear. I swung the light around, searching for any sign of movement. The beam caught on a broken branch, jagged and splintered, recently broken, I thought, then swept upward to the dark hollows of the trees. No one. No shadow. No shape. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining it, that my mind was turning on me after hours alone in the woods. Yet every hair on my neck stood on end. I took another tentative step forward, the flashlight's light falling on a faint glimmer near the base of a tree. I crouched down, heart pounding, and shone the beam directly onto the object. It was a small, crumpled scrap of paper, dirt-stained and torn. My fingers trembled as I picked it up and unfolded it. The words were hastily scrawled, uneven and hurried. Don't trust the path. They watch. They wait. No signature. No name. Just that chilling warning. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Someone else had been here, someone who'd known more than I did. But who? And where were they now? I stuffed the note into my jacket pocket and stood, scanning the forest once more. The footsteps were gone, but the weight of the message pressed down on me. I realized, with a sinking certainty, that I was no longer just being followed, I was being hunted. The trail twisted sharply ahead, sloping down toward a small creek I hadn't seen on the map. The sound of running water was faint but unmistakable. Maybe if I could reach it, I could find a way out or at least get my bearings. I quickened my pace, flashlight beam piercing the shadows. The forest seemed to close in tighter with every step, branches reaching out like grasping fingers. Then, as I neared the creek, the beam caught something else, footprints pressed into the soft earth at the water's edge. They were fresh, the mud still damp and disturbed. But what caught my breath was the size and shape, not human. I blinked, shining the light again. The prints were small, irregular, almost paw-like, but too large for any animal I knew around here. I crouched down for a closer look, heart racing. Someone had made these deliberately, trying to confuse or mislead. Then, from the corner of my eye, a faint movement, a shadow slipping behind a cluster of bushes on the opposite bank. I turned sharply, flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. Just the rustling leaves and the creek's steady murmur. I swallowed hard. The realization hit me like a blow. Whoever was out here had been watching me, tracking me, and leaving cryptic signs both to warn and to taunt. I shoved the note deeper into my pocket and started back up the trail, the footsteps beginning anew, soft and rhythmic, always just behind. I dared not stop this time. The trees thinned slightly as I approached a clearing. Moonlight spilled across the ground, revealing an abandoned campsite. An old tent collapsed on one side, a smoldering fire pit with blackened stones, and scattered bits of torn fabric fluttering in the breeze. The acrid smell of smoke was stronger here. I moved cautiously, flashlight sweeping over the remnants. Suddenly, a glint caught my eye near the fire pit, a small metal object, half buried in the ash. I knelt and pried it loose, a battered pocket knife, its blade dull but unmistakably human-made. My pulse quickened. This wasn't just any campsite. Someone had lived here recently, watched me from close by, and left a fire burning, perhaps as a lure, or a message. Then a sound, a low, deliberate cough from the far edge of the clearing. I froze, every muscle coiled tight. The flashlight beam darted toward the noise. A figure stepped into the light, face obscured by shadow. No words, just a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach the eyes. "I've been waiting for you." The voice was quiet but steady, like a dark promise. I backed away, heart pounding, knowing that whatever game had started was far from over. And as the night closed around us, I understood I had crossed a line. There was no turning back. The figure took a step closer, and the cold air seemed to thicken between us. I fumbled for my phone, hands trembling, but it slipped from my grasp and hit the ground with a soft thud. Silence stretched, broken only by the rustling leaves underfoot. "Why?" I managed to whisper, voice barely audible. The shadowed smile deepened. "Because some debts can't be ignored," came the reply. With that, the figure melted back into the darkness, leaving me alone, breathless, and irrevocably tangled in a web I barely understood. Heart pounding, I bent down slowly, eyes scanning the dark for any sign of the figure. I stayed crouched beside the dying fire pit, the cold ash clinging to my palms as I tried to steady my ragged breathing. The forest around me had gone utterly silent, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I forced myself to rise slowly, flashlight raised, scanning the shadows. There was no sign of movement. No footsteps. Nothing. The trail behind me was swallowed by night and dense undergrowth, but the feeling of eyes watching remained heavy in my chest. I swallowed hard and took a step back toward the trail, trying to put distance between myself and the campsite. Every crack of a twig, every whisper of whine through the leaves seemed magnified. I kept glancing over my shoulder, flashlight beam darting through the dark, but the woods remained empty. Still, the footsteps, soft, deliberate, had started again. Always just behind me. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was someone else out here, not the figure, but someone who had found the campsite after me. Or worse, someone who'd been following me for miles. The thought tightened a knot in my stomach. I wasn't prepared for this. Not in the least. Then, as I walked, the trail narrowed sharply, the trees closing in on either side like a funnel. The moon had dipped behind a thick bank of clouds, and the last of the fading light was swallowed by the canopy. My flashlight flickered once, then steadied, but I could almost feel the darkness pressing closer. The footsteps never stopped. Even when I slowed to a halt, they continued, soft, even, like a heartbeat in rhythm with my own. I spun around again, shining the beam into the blackness, but there was nothing. No figure lurking, no sign of human presence beyond me. Fear was no longer just an abstract feeling. It was physical, an icy weight clamping my chest, a dry, rasping throat, trembling hands. I thought of all the stories I'd heard about people disappearing in places like this, swallowed by the wilderness or worse, by someone with no intention of being found. I forced myself forward, the trail twisting sharply downhill, roots jutting out like skeletal fingers. My boots scraped against loose stones and tangled branches. Every sound was amplified, a distant owl hoot, the rustle of leaves, the crunch of my own steps, and those footsteps that matched me, always just behind. Suddenly, a voice whispered my name. It wasn't loud, more like a breath against my ear, and it froze me in place. My heart thundered, a wild, desperate drum. "Who's there?" I called out, voice shaking. No answer. The footsteps quickened, matching my pace again, relentless. I started running, stumbling over roots and rocks, lungs burning, desperate to get away. But no matter how fast I moved, the footsteps kept pace, always just behind me. I reached a fork in the trail, one path leading deeper into dense thickets, the other climbing steeply toward a ridge. I hesitated, torn between the two. The ridge might give me a better vantage point, but it also exposed me to the cold night air and the possibility of being trapped. Then a flash of movement caught my eye, a shadow slipping between the trees on the left path. I stopped dead, heart pounding. The footsteps halted too. "Stop running," the voice said again, calmer, but still a threat. I swallowed my fear, voice barely steady. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" The figure emerged just beyond the edge of the trail, face still obscured in shadow but close enough now that I could see the faint outline of a knife handle tucked into a jacket pocket. "Because you came here," the voice said softly, "and you shouldn't have." I took a step back, starting around for anything at all that could help me. The last rays of moonlight shimmered weakly through the branches, casting long, sinister shadows. "Look," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt, "I don't want trouble. I'll leave. Just let me go." The figure hesitated, then smiled again, a slow, unsettling curl of the lips. "Not so simple." Before I could react, the shadow lunged. I stumbled backward, barely catching myself against a tree. The knife gleamed briefly in the dim light as it sliced through the air where I had been a moment before. Adrenaline surged through me. I spun and ran, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The footsteps behind me multiplied, no longer one, but two, three, closing in. I didn't dare look back. Branches whipped against my face and arms as I pushed through the undergrowth, desperate for any sign of the trail. My ankle caught on a root, and I fell hard, scraping my palms and knees. Pain seared through me, but I forced myself up and kept moving. Then I heard it, a voice, not the figure's, but someone else's, urgent and panicked, calling out from somewhere above the ridge. "Hey! Are you okay? Over here." I scrambled toward the sound, limbs trembling. The footsteps behind me faltered, then stopped. The figure's voice whispered one last warning. "This isn't over." I didn't dare pause. I pushed myself up the steep slope, towards the voice that promised something: rescue, or maybe just another unknown. When I reached the clearing at the top, a flashlight beam swept over me. A man in a bright jacket was standing there, his face etched with concern. "Come on, you're safe now," he said, reaching out a hand. But as I looked back into the dark woods below, I saw a shadow watching, unmoving, a silent promise that the nightmare was far from finished. The dawn crept in slow and pale the next morning, seeping through the thin curtains of the motel room like a hesitant visitor. The man in the bright jacket, the one who found me, had been a park ranger named Ellis. After dragging me away from the ridge, he called in backup and stayed with me through the night, his steady presence a fragile lifeline. I told him everything, leaving nothing out. The footsteps that mirrored mine, the whispered warnings, the knife glinting in the moonlight. He listened carefully, nodding grimly. "Someone's been watching you," Alice said. "Maybe for a while. You're not the first to spot signs of it, but no one ever got close enough to catch the guy. Not until now, I guess." I swallowed hard. "Why? Why me?" He shrugged. "Don't know. Maybe it's because you were alone, easy to track. Maybe because you went where you shouldn't have. These woods have secrets people don't want uncovered." He was right. My curiosity had led me deep into something darker than the simple wilderness I thought I'd escaped to. I'd been naive, thinking a solo hike could clear my head. Instead, it had nearly cost me my life. Alice promised to organize a search for the man, but warned me it wouldn't be easy. The forest was vast, and the figure was cunning, silent, invisible. A ghost with a blade. I knew that when I left the ranger station, the weight of the woods was still pressing down on me. The sunlight filtering through the trees no longer felt warm or welcoming. It felt watchful. I wasn't ready to go back into the forest, not yet. Over the next few days, the local police took my statement, collected my gear, and reviewed the footage from the ranger's body cam. The sharp outline of the knife handle was visible in some frames, but the man himself was always just out of focus, a blur at the periphery. No name, no face. I spent my nights replaying the chase, the whispered threats, the cold realization that someone had been stalking me all along. I thought about the footsteps that followed even when I stopped. The way he knew every move I made, anticipating it. But it wasn't just fear that gnawed at me. It was something deeper, an ache of vulnerability, and beneath it, a flicker of something else. Resolve. I wasn't going to let that shadow define me. On the third day, Alice came by with news. They found some evidence, a small campsite hidden deeper in the forest, partially burned, with signs someone had left in a hurry. A few items, a tattered jacket, and a knife matching the one I'd seen. No sign of a man, but it was a start. "We're closing in," Alice said quietly. "But he knows the woods better than any of us. He's patient. He waits." That night, I sat alone in the motel room, my ankle wrapped tight, the silence thick around me. The phone sat on the bedside table, silent. I thought about the figure, the invisible stalker who had slipped through the shadows, watching, waiting. I thought about the choices that had brought me here and the fear that had almost broken me. And then I thought about what I'd learned. I was stronger than I knew. The next morning, I made a decision. I wouldn't run forever. I couldn't. The forest held too much of me now, my fear, yes, but also my courage. I packed my bag carefully, including the small knife Alice had given me for protection. I wasn't going to seek out the man, no, that would be madness, but I wasn't going to let him claim this place or my peace. I returned to the trailhead, where the forest began in earnest. The air was cool, the trees towering and silent. I walked slowly, deliberately, every step measured. The footsteps were gone, but I carried their memory with me like a scar. Hours passed. I didn't hear anything behind me. No whispers, no knife glinting in the dim light. The forest was just forest. The shadows were just shadows. When I reached the clearing at the ridge, the place where I'd first seen that impossible knife handle, I stopped. I looked out over the valley below, the sun shining faintly through the morning mist. I'd faced the darkness. I'd survived. And though the man in the shadows might still be out there, waiting, I knew something he couldn't take away, the strength to keep moving forward, even when the path was uncertain. I turned away from the clearing and began the hike back down the trail, not running, not hiding, but walking, steady, unbroken. The forest whispered around me, but this time, I listened with open eyes. Each step felt lighter, as if the weight pressing on my chest had finally begun to lift. The trees, once ominous silhouettes, now seemed like old friends guiding me home. Birds chirped tentatively, their songs weaving through the rustling leaves, reminding me that life persisted beyond fear. Somewhere ahead, a faint brook chuckled over smooth stones, its steady murmur grounding me in the present. I breathed deeply, the crisp air filling my lungs with a new sense of purpose. Whatever lay ahead, I was no longer running from shadows, I was embracing the uncertain light, ready to face whatever came next with quiet resolve. The path stretched onward, each step lighter than the last, as dawn painted the sky with hues of hope and renewal. Mist curled gently around the roots of ancient oaks, their gnarled branches reaching skyward like silent sentinels. A soft rustle caught my attention, a flash of movement among the ferns. A squirrel paused, its bright eyes meeting mine for a brief moment before darting away, a tiny spark of life thriving in the stillness. Further along, the brook widened, pooling into a small, clear pond. Sunlight fractured across its surface, scattering diamonds in every direction. Kneeling at the water's edge, I cupped my hands and drank, the cool liquid grounding me deeper in this moment of awakening. Above, birdsong wove through the branches, a symphony of chirps and trills that seemed to echo the promise carried in the morning breeze. I closed my eyes, letting the melody wash over me, each note a thread stitching together fragments of courage I hadn't known I possessed. With renewed determination, I stood and continued, the forest canopy opening ever so slightly to reveal patches of sky. The path ahead remained uncertain, but the fear that once clouded my steps had softened into something steadier, a quiet confidence, fragile yet unyielding. I thought of the shadows I'd left behind, and without anger or regret, I let them fall away like leaves in autumn, making space for growth. The journey was far from over, but in this moment, with the dawn breaking and life humming around me, I felt the first true taste of peace.